All right, I will give you a surefire way of dealing with these nightmares of yours, and even if they return, it will still work, the parasite said. Nick furrowed his brows. You also said you know what's happening to me. I want to know that first. The parasite uttered. I mean, I know what's happening to you, but I can't tell you a lot of details. Nick narrowed his eyes. Why not? Telling you might endanger my presence here in Crimson Fungus City, the parasite said. If you want every last detail, you gotta buy me out of the city since I can't trade with anyone here anymore. Buy you out of the city? Nick asked with furrowed brows. That's possible. Of course, everything has its price, the parasite said. And how much would that be? Nick asked. He knew he couldn't afford it, but he wanted to know how much the parasite asked for anyway. 3 specialists, 30 experts, 300 veterans, 3,000 Johns, or 30,000 normal people. Your pick. Nick had been prepared for an astronomical sum, but he hadn't expected it to be this high. So if I want to know what's happening to me, I have to pay that, right? Nick asked. I will tell you what's happening to you, but I won't reveal any details, the parasite said. I'm not a complete monster, you know. Nick took a deep breath. Fine, what do you want and what's happening to me? Nick asked. Okay, I can tell you what's happening to you right now since that won't endanger the trade. But before I tell you, I want you and the little Melfian boy to accept the trade. I want a couple more corpses than back then, the parasite said. How many do you want? Nick asked. Energy equivalent to 50 normal people. That means 50 normal people, 10 peak newbies, 5 initial Johns, or 1 peak John. You can also mix and match, but everything has to add up to at least 50 normal people of power, the parasite explained. Nick gritted his teeth. That many corpses just to get rid of his nightmares. Just to get rid of the nightmares, Nick asked with fury. These nightmares are not just nightmares, Nick, the rat said. I can tell you one thing with 100% confidence. If you do not get rid of these nightmares, you will die within a couple of months. I absolutely assure you that these nightmares will kill you. Nick's eyes widened in horror and shock. Yes, the nightmares were bad, but how could they kill him? At most, Nick would remain tired, grumpy, and angry all the time, but that wasn't a death sentence. How? Nick asked. I can't reveal that detail, the parasite said. I can tell you the nightmares are not the knife that's going to pierce through your heart. More accurately, they're what will push you towards the knife. Nick blinked with narrowed eyes. You mean they will make me commit suicide? No, that's not it, the parasite said with insecurity. It's more that they will make you do something that will make a specific someone kill you. Why would they make someone kill me? Nick asked with annoyance. Why wouldn't that someone kill me directly? Because they're a Specter. There, I said it. You happy now? The rat shouted. You get that piece of information free of charge, but I want you to accept my trade, or I'm going to plunge all of Dark Dream into a nightmare, got it? Nick's eyes widened. A Specter, he repeated in shock. Yes, the rat shouted. You're being targeted by a Specter, an extremely powerful one at that. He's so powerful you can't even hope to fight back. But lucky for you, he doesn't gain power from killing people. Otherwise, you would already be dead. However, if he feeds on you, you will end up dead. Nick heard the rat sigh. Listen, I'm already on thin ice after telling you all of this. I seriously can't tell you more. I'll keep one of my rats below Dark Dream. Tell me how you will deliver the corpses to me later. And hurry up. After the rat said all this, Nick heard it scurrying away. Nick narrowed his eyes at one of the walls of the abandoned house. A powerful Specter had targeted him. Nick had thought the nightmares were just from all the stress regarding envy and wanting to help the Dregs. Yet they had actually been caused by a Specter. This explained why it was so hard for Nick to deal with them. When it came to things like nightmares, there were things one could do against them. However, when these same nightmares were caused by a Specter, there was nothing one could do unless one killed it. But the parasite said the Specter was extremely powerful and that Nick had no hope of fighting it. I need more details, Nick thought as he exited the abandoned house. Halfway to Dark Dream, Nick had a thought. Wait, if the nightmares are caused by a Specter, can another Specter get rid of them? Could the dreamer get rid of them? That's most likely the solution to my problem, and also why the parasite demands the corpses now instead of asking for them later. After knowing this is caused by a Specter, it's not very difficult to come to that solution, which means the parasite basically already told me what to do. Nick took a deep breath. I guess there's no way around it anymore. I have to send 50 corpses to the parasite. Nick sighed and entered Dark Dream. It was already quite late, and Wintour was already home. One more night of nightmares won't kill me. Otherwise, the parasite would have been much more urgent about all of this. After another night full of nightmares, Nick entered Wintour's office to talk to him. Chapter 257, The Parasite's Influence. Nick and Wintour talked about Nick's nightmares for a while. I actually noticed you seemed different from usual, Wintour said. I thought the stress was getting to you. Nick sighed. I thought the same thing. Nick, if you're targeted by a powerful Specter, what stops it from just killing you? Wintour asked. I don't know. Apparently, it doesn't get power from killing people, but when it gets power, the process will kill a person, Nick said. So what do we do about this? Nick asked. What else? Wintour answered with a shrug. You basically already agreed to the trade on Dark Dream's behalf. We have to give the parasite his corpses now, or Dark Dream will be in serious trouble. Nick sighed. I'm sorry, Wintour. Oh, don't sweat it, Wintour said with a dismissive wave. I would have agreed to the trade anyway. You're worth much more than 50 corpses. Sadly, that only marginally reduced Nick's guilt. Is it true? Nick asked. What? That basically everyone is trading with the parasite. Wintour nodded. Yep, I didn't want you to know, but basically all the manufacturers regularly trade with the parasite, and they give him a lot of corpses. Many of the manufacturers are even indebted to him. The number of corpses the parasite asks for is based on how many a manufacturer can provide, which means a more powerful manufacturer has to pay more. Naturally, getting that many corpses without arousing suspicion is extremely difficult, which is why the parasite accepts them in installments. Some of the manufacturers have to pay off their debt over months. Of course, the parasite is smart enough not to put too much debt on everyone. Otherwise, the manufacturers might unite to get rid of him so they don't need to repay it. Whether you like it or not, the parasite's existence is woven into the foundation of Crimson Fungus City, Wintour explained. Nick took a deep breath. He hadn't thought the parasite's power was this great. Everyone knew the parasite, even the people in the Dregs. Yet all the normal people, even the normal extractors, didn't know the true extent of the parasite's power. Everyone thought the city tried to get rid of the parasite. But it wasn't. So how do we get the corpses? Nick asked. I'll simply reroute the Screaming Coffin's corpses to the parasite, Wintour said calmly. The Screaming Coffin won't die from a lack of corpses, and it isn't nearly strong enough to break out of its containment unit. It can just walk in circles inside its containment unit for 50 days or so. Nick sighed again. He hated that he was improving the parasite's power just so he could survive. It felt selfish, it felt dirty. I must improve the lives of the people in the future, Nick thought with conviction. I have already taken out so many moral and ethical loans that it feels difficult to repay them, but I have to give it my all. Tell him he'll get his corpses every day at 10 a.m., Wintour said. Nick nodded. The two of them talked for a bit more before Nick left Wintour's office to talk to the parasite. On the first floor inside the building was an empty room no one was allowed to walk into. When Nick and Wintour had received the building after dealing with Cycle, they had seen that one of the plates on the ground was loose inside this room. Wintour immediately knew this was where Artem traded with the parasite back when he had still owned Cycle. Wintour decided to leave the room like this, since they might need to contact the parasite again in the future. Nick walked into the room and moved the metal plate aside. After moving a couple more things below it, Nick could see the sewers below him. Hey! Suddenly, a rat's head popped up from around the corner before looking around. Where are my corpses? It asked. We don't have that many in storage right now, Nick said. We accepted your offer. Every day at 10 a.m. you'll get one corpse. That will continue for the next 50 days. The corpses will come through here. The rat seemed disappointed but quickly perked up again. Sure, no problem. So what about the solution? Nick asked. The rat blinked. I thought you would have already realized the solution. Do you mean the dreamer? Nick asked. So you did, the rat said. Yes, the dreamer deals with dreams and it doesn't like when other specters step into its domain. The specter that's targeting you is much more powerful than the dreamer, but even he can't fight it inside a dream. With that other specter influencing your mind while you sleep, the dreamer can't feed, which is why it will get rid of the foreign influence. Work with the dreamer once and your issue will be solved, and if it ever starts again, just do the same thing. Nick sighed in relief. So I won't die? Nick asked. the parasite muttered. That can still happen, but the chances are much lower. The Specter will just try to push you towards the knife another way. Nick furrowed his brows. Naturally, he wasn't happy with that. However, there was one more thing he wanted to ask the parasite. Is the Specter that's targeting me a servant of a fallen or an adversary? Nick asked. PFFFT, the rat sputtered. Hell no, if he were, I wouldn't be here and you'd all be dead. He's just like me, a free agent, no allegiances whatsoever. Nick took a deep breath and sighed. He wasn't sure whether he should be happy or not. He honestly didn't know what he'd prefer. Nevertheless, it was time to wait for Envy's servant to strike again. But before that, Nick needed to pay the dreamer a visit. Chapter 258, Renegotiation. Nick told Jenny he would take one shift working with the dreamer today. As a reason, he said he wanted to be familiar with all the Specters and hadn't worked with the dreamer in a long time. Jenny immediately gave Nick the next shift, and a couple of hours later, Nick walked into the dreamer's containment unit. Jonathan had just been working with the dreamer, and Nick woke him up as soon as he entered. Jonathan immediately panicked when he saw Nick. Why was Nick here? Did Jonathan do something wrong? Nick quickly calmed him down, and Jonathan left the containment unit. Now only Nick and the dreamer were left inside. Nick looked at the dreamer, who only silently looked back. Today we're going to work together, Nick said. The dreamer didn't answer. Nick lay down near one of the walls and closed his eyes. Some seconds later, Nick felt the dreamer standing beside him. Some seconds passed, and some more and even more. After several minutes, Nick opened his eyes and furrowed them at the dreamer beside him. Is there an issue? Nick asked. The dreamer, standing directly beside Nick, just looked at him. Nick looked back with annoyance. I'll ask again, is there an issue? Nick asked. Scratch. Nick looked down and saw the dreamer had scratched the floor with one of its talons. Do you want to say something? Nick asked. Scratch, scratch. The dreamer's talons scratched twice. Nick took a deep breath. He hadn't thought it would actually happen, but he had considered the possibility. A change in power dynamic. It had always been Nick and Dark Dream dictating the rules, not the dreamer. But now things were different. After looking through the memories of everyone who had worked with the dreamer, it knew Nick was the chief Zephyx Extractor. It knew Nick was far more important than normal employees. All right, Nick said, 1 scratch for yes, 2 scratches for no, 3 scratches means the question isn't important. Do you understand? Scratch. The dreamer kept looking at Nick with its dead stare, but it scratched once to show it understood. Nick sighed. Do you know why I am actually here? Nick asked. Scratch. Just as I thought, Nick thought. Do you want to negotiate something? Nick asked. Scratch. Nick took a deep breath. Do you see the influence of a strong Specter on me? Nick asked. Scratch. Can you get rid of it? Scratch. Nick took another deep breath. Do you want to get out? Scratch, scratch. Nick furrowed his brows. You answered no instead of irrelevant. Do you actually want to stay here, or is it just not important? 1 scratch for wanting to stay, 2 for not important. Scratch. Nick looked at the dreamer for a while. The dreamer had just said it didn't even want to leave. Nick didn't fully trust it, but he was willing to believe it. While 85% of all the Zephyx it produced was confiscated, it could still feed on John's every minute of every day. This made Dark Dream an ideal place to feed. Nick took a deep breath. All right, so you want to stay. You're saying you wouldn't want to escape even if you weren't inside a containment unit. Is that right? Scratch. Obviously, I'm not letting you out, Nick said. If you were in my place, you also wouldn't let yourself out. Scratch. At least it's honest, Nick thought. Nick took another deep breath. All right, don't think of me as barbaric, Nick said. I could theoretically go the hard-ass route and say it's my way or the highway, but I'm not going to do that. You have been with us for 4 years and there haven't been any incidents. The only people you killed are the ones you were told to kill, right? Nick asked. Scratch. For 4 years, you have produced Zephyx without causing any issues. On top of that, you know you're basically the only one who can help me out of my current predicament, I presume. Scratch. So now you want to renegotiate with all of this considered, right? Scratch. All right, Nick said. You are currently getting 15% of the Zephyx and you're already an early adolescent. You have to know it won't help either of us if you get too powerful. If you get too strong, it gets too dangerous to work with you. Scratch, scratch. Nick raised an eyebrow. Are you saying you becoming more powerful won't endanger weaker employees? Scratch. Nick furrowed his brows. Just to make sure, if I were to send an initial newbie with little willpower to you, they won't die. Scratch. But I guess you won't produce as much Zephyx, Nick said. Scratch. So you can stop working with someone before they die, right? Scratch. Nick took a deep breath. All right, he said, then let's talk about your future terms. I will still prioritize Johns when choosing who works with you, but I'm also allowed to send peak newbies to you. Working with you should help them become Johns quicker. In exchange, your share of Zephyx increases from 15% to 25%. That's the deal. I honestly can't give you more. Otherwise, you'd only be working 8 hours a day because you'd become so strong nobody could work with you, and sadly, I'm too busy. Do you agree? Scratch. Nick's eyebrows rose. That was easy. Nick repeated the terms of the new agreement, and the dreamer once more confirmed it accepted. All right, Nick said, then we have a deal. Let me go outside and change the settings on the containment unit. Nick stood up, changed the settings, and came back in. All good, Nick said. Then he lay down beside the dreamer. Now can we start? The dreamer looked at Nick, and Nick quickly grew tired. As soon as Nick fell asleep, the nightmare returned. For just a couple of seconds, the dreamer looked at the nightmare. Then the nightmare dispersed, replaced by the dreamer's own creation. Nick's issue with the nightmares was solved. Chapter 259, Caravan. How much will it be this time? A man in a luxurious suit looked at another man wearing some kind of silver armor. The two stood near the middle of the inner city. Behind the man in armor were several more people and a huge wagon. The wagon was over 20 meters long and nearly 5 meters high, carried by over 20 gigantic tires. Just by the looks of it, the wagon probably weighed several tons. The lower half was solid steel with no openings, but the upper half had a couple of openings to let light in. Through the openings, one would see a luxurious interior filled with several beds. 4 people stood in front of the wagon, near several grabbable parts. Usually people would feel shocked seeing the 4 people. After all 4 were experts. Yet no one even batted an eye at the wagon and the people, since they were here every month. It was a trading caravan, and the 4 experts were there to pull the wagon. Yes, their only job was to pull it. Around the wagon were 5 other people, looking at the interior of the inner city with boredom. All 5 were specialists, level 5 extractors. But there was one more person. The one in the silver armor, currently talking to the person in the suit. This person had a shocking identity. He was a hero, a level 6 extractor. And he was the leader and owner of the trading caravan. They moved from city to city, buying local specialties at a low price and selling them at a much higher price. There was a lot of money to be made this way. After all, traveling through the outside world was supremely dangerous. In general, there were 4 kinds of specters outside the cities. First, freshly born specters. These were very weak and valuable. Almost all of them were hatchlings. Second, specters that had to flee from a city to survive. Those ranged from hatchlings to fanatics and even the occasional demon. Third, specters that operated from outside any cities, like the parasite. These tended to be very dangerous, and this was generally only possible after a specter became a fanatic. Lastly, specters that had destroyed a city. Almost all of them were fallen, and they were very rare. If one was lucky, one wouldn't meet any specters except some hatchlings, which could be sold for a ton of money in any city. However, if one was unlucky, one could come across an extremely powerful specter, and even if it didn't care about the group, it might decide to use the humans to sneak into a new city. After which the group would die, of course. Going outside was extremely dangerous. But that was why trading between cities was so valuable. And these people earned their living this way. The food has proven to be a great hit, the man in the silver armor said to the man in the suit. The man in the suit was a representative from the city, sent to negotiate with the trading caravan. We're glad to hear that, the man in the suit said with a friendly smile. I presume you want more this time. The man in the silver armor nodded. Not many people are interested in the big mosquito larvae of this city, but the few who tried them loved them. I'll take a stock of about 150 kg this time. The man in the suit nodded and wrote something on a small piece of paper. People also love your rusty cubes. I keep telling them they're called mixed meat cubes, but they just keep calling them rusty cubes because of their color, the man in the silver armor said with a laugh. I get it, the other man answered with a laugh. Put me down for 800 kg of those. For a couple of minutes, the man kept asking for more and more things. In the end, he bought over 3 tons of food and another 8 tons of miscellaneous goods. The man in the suit drew up a contract, and after some negotiation, they agreed on terms. After the contract was signed, the man in the armor took out several white crystals. Each crystal represented 5 kilograms of solidified Zephyx. The crystals were carefully put into a suitcase, guarded by a specialist. A moment later, several people appeared in the plaza, carrying crates filled with different items. Anything interesting happened lately? The man in the silver armor asked casually. Not much, everything's basically the same, the man in the suit answered. Oh right, I've heard there's a new manufacturer in the city, the man in the silver armor commented. The man in the suit furrowed his brows. Is there? He asked in confusion. I think so, the man answered. At least I've heard someone say it. What was their name again? Dark Dream. Oh right, the man in the suit said. I'd say they're kind of new, although I thought you would have already heard about them. They've been here for a couple of years already. How are they doing? The man in the silver armor asked. Pretty good as far as I can tell, but that's to be expected. The owner of Dark Dream is the son of Vernon Melfian. Oh, the man in the silver armor said. Then things make sense. I was surprised since it's so rare to see a new manufacturer appear in any city. Are they here in the inner city? No, they're in the outer city, the guy in the suit said casually. Pretty big building in the south. You basically can't miss it. Interesting, the man in the silver armor said. Chapter 260, The Prison. When all the wares were loaded into the wagon, the caravan turned around and traveled out of the inner city. In the outer city, they followed one of the major roads south. The leading man of the caravan looked west and saw a couple of big buildings. One of them was quite a bit taller than the others. With his powerful senses, he could read the sign on the distant building. Dark Dream. We're going to continue traveling tomorrow, the leading man declared. The others in the caravan nodded and started talking among themselves before splitting up to look at the city. The leading man went into the huge wagon and looked at the distant building of Dark Dream. His eyes scanned the entrance at all times. As soon as the target appeared, he would get it. He had been on this mission for over a year now, and he looked forward to returning to his normal routine. However, some minutes later, something unexpected happened. The man looked toward the gate of the inner city. Just then, a young blue-haired man walked out of the gate. By the looks of things, he was walking right toward the caravan. Even more, the distant young man looked directly at the man in the silver armor inside the huge wagon. The silver man noticed and furrowed his brows. A specialist? What did a specialist want from him? Well, with luck, the specialist wanted to join them. The blue-haired man stopped about 5 meters from the wagon and looked at it with a smile. One of the specialists of the caravan noticed and rudely stepped between the blue-haired man and the wagon. Hey, you're not allowed to be here, he reprimanded. The blue-haired man didn't even turn to the specialist. Instead, he just looked at the wagon. You really don't want the following words to reach the ears of any onlookers, Julian, the blue-haired man said. Inside the caravan, the man in silver armor furrowed his brows. He wasn't sure what the blue-haired man wanted, but he still used his Zephyx to create a barrier that isolated sound. Something like that wasn't difficult to achieve with many years of experience manipulating Zephyx. Julian smiled politely. Then more and more mouths opened on his face. The eyes of the man in silver armor turned lifeless and absent-minded. What do you want? A terrifyingly deep voice came out of the wagon itself. There was no reason to hide anymore. The blue-haired man obviously knew the wagon's true identity. You've taken my prey, the many mouths spoke at the same time, their lips beautiful and their teeth immaculately white. And why should I care? The wagon asked. You're no threat to me. The Zephyx in the surroundings increased, and everything around Julian and the wagon seemed to turn blurry. From the outside, it looked like a blue-haired man was politely talking to a man in silver armor. But in truth, an amalgamation of beautiful mouths faced a transforming wagon of steel. The man in the silver armor vanished, just like all the furniture inside the top of the wagon. The wagon expanded upward, and its skin split apart into the shape of several windows with metal bars. Inside each window were several malnourished humans of all ages, sexes, sizes, and power levels. All of them hopelessly looked outside at Crimson Fungus City. A select few shouted loudly, hoping anyone outside would notice their pleas, but based on the lack of enthusiasm from the other humans, it was probably hopeless. The top of the wagon grew until it revealed a long, gaunt figure of plates, wires, and razors. Finally, its true form was unveiled. Its humongous torso was an amalgamation of prisons, and several long, powerful arms of steel extended out of them, all controlled by the gaunt metal figure growing from the top. Most shocking of all, the humans in the prisons were real. They were actual humans being imprisoned. This was the prison, a demon. It was a mid-demon, and it gained power by imprisoning people. The more powerful and numerous the people, the more Zephyx it gained. With its incredible illusion powers, it traveled from city to city, acting like a trading caravan. The 10 people traveling with the wagon were all illusions. And how did it hide from the sensors in every city? The Zephyx crystals. The sensors always alerted the city that something with a lot of Zephyx was moving through the gate. The only thing the prison had to do was show the crystals. Obviously, the crystals were the reason for the alarm. Like this, the prison traveled from city to city, and whenever it saw a good target, it would consume it, trapping the target inside one of the cells of its abdomen. To make sure nobody connected the disappearances with the caravan, the prison left an illusion of the person behind for a couple of days. Lastly, it was also one of Envy's most powerful servants. "Why should I care?" the prison repeated, its voice dark and metallic. "I'm a servant of Lord Envy, general of the almighty famine." "Crawl back to wherever you came from," the prison shouted. "You have barely reached the 5th level. While you might be powerful in this little city of yours, your power is worthless in the wider world," the prison said. "I'm a servant of Lord Envy, general of the almighty famine." "Crawl back to wherever you came from," the prison shouted. "And be glad that I am not forcing you to become my servant right now." Silence. But then all the mouths started to grin and laugh. "Lord Envy," the mouth said. "Almighty famine. True, I am far weaker than any of those. I am even weaker than you. But this is my city." Chapter 261, Mouths. "Your city," the prison repeated in a mocking tone. "You live in hiding just like any other Specter. This is a city controlled by the humans." However, the mouths just laughed. Then the amalgamation of mouths walked away from the wagon. The prison watched as the amalgamation of mouths walked out of its illusory domain. At this moment, the amalgamation of mouths was walking through the outer city without any disguise. "Hey Julian, haven't seen you in a while," one of the stall owners said with an excited smile. "I've been busy recently, sorry," one of the mouths facing the stall owner said in a friendly tone. "Of course, I get it. Hey, congratulations on becoming a specialist," the woman said. "Thanks, Charlotte," the mouth said. The amalgamation of mouths flowed up one of the buildings and extended toward the sky. It slowly grew until it assumed the form of a tree. The trunk, branches, leaves, flowers, and fruits of the tree were all made of laughing mouths. At this moment, the tree could probably be seen from all across the outer city. "This is my city," the mouth said in a special rhythm. "If I want to be seen, I will be seen. If I don't want to be seen, I won't be seen. Everyone I have talked to is under my control. And the few that aren't." The mouths chuckled as 2 people in the streets ran away, shouting in panic that there was a gigantic monster on one of the roofs. Yet everyone else just looked at the 2 of them like they were crazy. The 2 kept shouting that the blue-haired man had turned into a huge monster. "Julian, he's not a Specter," everyone answered, annoyed that some people were badmouthing their good friend. 2 of the mouths on the tree extended toward the panicked pair. "You seem a bit confused," they said. "Hi, I'm Julian. I think we haven't met yet." The more the mouths talked, the calmer the 2 became. Eventually, the 2 casually talked with the mouths. "This city is mine," Julian repeated. "You might be more powerful than me." "But are you more powerful than the city?" the mouths asked. While the mouths talked, more and more of them fell off the tree, traveling toward panicked and concerned people. By the end, over 100 mouths flowed through the city, stopping occasionally to exchange a few words with someone. The metallic figure atop the cells looked with a neutral expression at the tree of mouths. The prison knew it was much more powerful than Julian. In a direct fight, the prison could tear Julian apart like paper. However, while keeping its illusions active in a calm scenario was easy, the same didn't apply in battle. With enough havoc, even the heroes would come out of the inner city to look at what was going on. At that point, the prison was bound to be found out. While its chances of escape were high, it would never be able to return to Crimson Fungus City. And worse, Crimson Fungus City would warn all the other cities. "You are putting on a strong front," the prison said in its dark, metallic voice. "While you can control these weak people, I am certain you can't do the same to the heroes. If we battle, you will also be found out. I have a shot at survival, and even at actually winning against the city. You don't." The mouths kept laughing. "Which is why I haven't sent Kugelblitz after you yet," the mouths spoke in unison. "If they find you, they might become more careful, which will make it harder for me to stay hidden. We both have something to lose. And that is why you will leave my city and never return," the mouth spoke. The metallic figure atop the cells looked at the tree of mouths. The prison often met opposition in cities. Surprisingly, it had far more conflicts with specters than with humans. Many cities were secretly controlled by powerful specters who didn't want to share their food with the prison. And it almost always ended the same way. "What do you want?" the prison asked. "A trade agreement." The prison would deliver food and incredible goods that resulted in more humans, which resulted in more food for the specters. "What do I want?" the mouths repeated with friendly laughter. "I want you to go and never return," they said. The prison looked at the tree of mouths. "You are not willing to compromise?" it asked. "No," the mouths answered. "Silence." "Fine," the prison answered with a neutral voice, "but I have to take one last person." "No, you won't," the tree of mouths said. "This is not for me," the prison said. "This is for..." "Envy, yes," the mouths interrupted. "You want Nick. The one with the power of the null." The prison looked with a neutral gaze at the tree of mouths. If it were human, it would have felt shock and surprise. "Yes," the prison said. "Lord Envy desires the power of the null." The mouths chuckled. "And why should I care?" they answered, throwing the prison's words back at it. "Because Lord Envy will kill you if you refuse to comply," the prison said. "Lord Envy is vastly more powerful than this puny little Crimson Fungus City. Lord Envy even has 2 fallen as servants. You have no choice in the matter. Keeping the null's power for yourself will only end your existence," the prison declared. Yet the mouths just kept laughing. "Theoretically, yes," the mouth said. "Practically, no. Lucky for me, Envy and its most powerful servants are busy fighting Aegis at this moment. Why should I be afraid of a sharp knife in your hand when you are so far away?" Chapter 262, Future Eternal. The prison looked at Julian for quite a while. It hadn't expected Julian to know Envy was stuck fighting Aegis. It was true. Envy couldn't spare any of its powerful servants since Aegis was putting enormous pressure on it. However, that will not always be the case, the prison said. You are making a decision out of a momentary situation that will have permanent consequences. The mouths chuckled. "It's not permanent," they answered. "The rate of my growth is unmatched. I only need to become a demon, after which I will take control of the leadership of this city. And then my power will not only be contained in this city. The governor can call Aegis. Is your lord willing to risk its powerful servants for a desire for revenge?" The smiles on the mouths turned cocky. "Is your lord that human?" The prison looked evenly at the tree of mouths. "I will ask one last time. Are you not willing to hand over a weak human to ensure your survival?" the prison asked. "If you had asked me before taking my food, I would have handed him over," the tree said. "But you and your lord took from my plate without asking. Maybe I have been around humans too much, but I think I should feel offended and disrespected by that. And I also think I should now make irrational decisions born out of anger." The mouth snickered. "Being human is much more fun than being a specter." The prison kept looking at the tree. "You are dead set on making an irrational decision?" the prison asked with a bland tone. The mouth stopped laughing but didn't stop grinning maliciously. "When you are an eternal, can any decision be irrational?" they asked. "When there are no negative consequences to your actions, do your actions even matter?" "You are not an eternal," the prison answered immediately. "But I will be," the mouths answered. "Silence. Look at the city. Everyone knows me, but nobody knows my true existence. I am inside everyone's mind, but everyone will ignore the truth. Every single person sees me, but not a single person can see me. In this city, am I not the sun and the null at the same time? The mouth spoke arrogantly. And what when I become a fallen? What when I become an adversary? When I become an adversary, I can stop the shields from seeing me. Then only the specters can be my enemies. But since I will be among the strongest of humanity, I am safe as long as humanity is safe. Do you understand what this means? This means that when I become an adversary, it is only a matter of time until I become an eternal. As a demon, I can feed on every city. I can leave this one and go to another without any issues. As a fallen, I can feed on Aegis strongholds. And as an adversary, I can feed on all of humanity. Humanity will be my weapon, my shield, and my food. So why should I care about some fallen called envy? It is not me that should surrender before envy, so I won't be killed. It is envy that should surrender before me, so I won't kill it. The prison kept looking at the tree of mouths. You are not the first to speak such grand words, the prison said evenly. And you won't be the last. Specters like you always fall to your own hubris. And most of the time, it happens at the hands of the very things you consider food. Becoming human will never work out. Specters are not human. The mouths chuckled. What about Nurse Alice? The mouths asked. She is an eternal. She is different, the prison said calmly. If she can be human, why can't I be human? The mouths asked. The prison looked at the tree of mouths. Then it gave up. It had seen a couple of specters just like this one. The prison had been to many cities, and some had specters just like this one. Specters that thought their rise was unstoppable and unavoidable. And then they became fallen, and things suddenly grew very difficult. A fallen could only properly grow by feeding on protectors, and all protectors belonged to Aegis. And Aegis was damn good at finding and fighting fallen. While it was easy for a fallen to survive, it was almost impossible for one to reliably grow. For one simple reason. The fallen's food source was its most dangerous enemy. Since specters didn't suffer the weakness of biological matter, they didn't naturally expire. There were fallen tens of thousands of years old that still hadn't managed to become adversaries. That was because these fallen were forced to feed extremely rarely and carefully. Fallen that fed rapidly didn't tend to live long. The prison could see the tree of mouths joining the latter group. Of course, the prison didn't care about the tree's fate. Unfortunately, the tree's arrogance made it irrational, which made it impossible for the prison to leave with its target. But there were other things the prison could do. There is no value in this conversation, the prison said. A moment later, all the people who had left the wagon came back. Change of plans. We're leaving now, the man in silver armor shouted. The experts went to the front and pulled the wagon toward the exit of the city. But in truth, the prison was just slowly floating down the streets. Until we meet again, future eternal, the prison said mockingly. The mouths kept chuckling. Then the tree shrank, and all the mouths gathered in one spot again before turning back into the figure of a blue-haired man. Eventually, the prison left the city. A specter generally only cared about its own survival, and the prison wasn't an exception. So as long as the prison was far from the city, Julian's power didn't matter. Envy was the servant of famine. The prison was the servant of envy. Naturally, just like the other two, the prison had servants of its own. And it didn't care about their survival. Chapter 263, The Can. Nobody noticed the confrontation between Julian and the prison. However, it had a lasting effect on Crimson Fungus City, even though the effect wasn't very strong. The caravan never reappeared. 1 month later, the people were waiting for the caravan's arrival. But it never came. In the end, they guessed something must have happened to it. The city made less Zephyx as a result, which was bad for the economy. However, the people in the outer city and the Dregs were happy. While they didn't know what happened, the people in the outer city noticed the price of mixed meat cubes had sunk. So they bought more of those, and since they tasted better than veggie cubes, they preferred them. But that left more veggie cubes, which reduced their prices a bit. The end result was that food in the Dregs had become marginally cheaper, which made the people there quite happy. While all of this was going on, Nick just kept working at his job. He hadn't noticed that Envy's powerful servant had already arrived and left. Once more, Nick was stuck in limbo. At some point, Envy or one of its servants would come for him. The paranoia and fear never left. Luckily, they weren't as strong anymore after Julian had said Nick didn't need to worry. Time continued to pass. Soon another year had passed. Nick was now 21 years old, and he'd recently become a peak John. During that year, the people of Dark Dream also grew much stronger. Including Nick, there were now 11 Johns in Dark Dream. Nick was a peak John. Jenny and Trevor were mid-Johns. Jonathan, Constance, Marvilla, Larry, and Kiara were early Johns. Cryon, Carrie, and Taryn were initial Johns. On top of that, Dark Dream had 7 peak newbies, and 3 of them would also soon become Johns. Aside from that, Dark Dream had hired 6 new employees. 3 were late newbies, and 3 were early newbies. Nick decided he would always hire new people in groups of 3. He had noticed that working with the Blood Hawk and Blood Horse was most efficient with 3 people. If there were only 2, the number of complaints increased drastically. Sadly, Dark Dream only managed to get 1 more Specter this year. The newest Specter was a strange one. It was a possession Specter called the Can. It looked like a rusty can made of metal, and the fact that Dark Dream managed to get it was extremely lucky. One day, one of the investigators of Dark Dream walked home and saw a can on the way. Bored, they kicked it. Tragically, their angle was slightly off, and they hit the ground in front of the can, breaking their big toe. Luckily, they could still walk and work. Some days later, another inspector was coming home and also saw a can. They remembered a colleague had broken their toe kicking a metal can and laughed. What if that happened to them too? With a laugh, they kicked the can. Crack! Yet when they kicked it, the can got stuck in a rusty part of the ground, and the inspector felt like they'd hit a pillar of metal. Naturally, their big toe broke. In the end, they just stared at the can in absolute shock. "I refuse to believe I'm that bad at kicking," they shouted in anger. Then they grabbed the can and walked toward Dark Dream. After waiting near the entrance a while, the inspector grabbed the first extractor who came out, one of the peak newbies. The inspector told the extractor to kick the can. Naturally, the extractor was confused and asked what was going on. The inspector explained that 2 inspectors had broken their toes kicking a can and refused to believe they'd done it on an ordinary can. This had to be a Specter. The extractor didn't believe them, chuckled, and kicked the can. Bang! Tragically, they missed and hit the hard building, breaking their toe. "Ah, you see, I knew it," the inspector shouted. The extractor stared at the can in shock. Then the 2 of them waited in front of the entrance for the next extractor. The next extractor to come out was an initial John, and they asked them to kick the can. The initial John was perplexed, but after hearing that 3 people had already broken their toes, they grew suspicious too. Nervously, the initial John kicked the can. Bang! The initial John hit the can perfectly, and it fell over. The other 2 stared in surprise at the fallen can. But then the initial John grabbed their foot in pain. "What the fuck is this thing made of?" they shouted in horror. They removed their shoe, and everyone saw a bloody toe. Everyone stared at the toe in shock. The extractor had hit the can perfectly. Yet their toe broke. The toe of an initial John broke after kicking a random metal can. That settled it. This had to be a possession Specter. They immediately threw it into the last free containment unit on the 2nd floor and stationed an extractor in front of it. The next day, they reported to Nick, and Nick inspected the can. He kicked it lightly, but nothing happened. Then he used more and more force. The can acted like a normal metal can, except it didn't dent under Nick's kicks. Boom! Suddenly, Nick gritted his teeth. Just now, the can had become insanely tough. Yet it also hit the wall of the containment unit with a ton of force and took a big dent. After removing his shoe, Nick looked at his bleeding toe. Luckily, it wasn't broken. This meant the can was weaker than a peak adolescent, but stronger than an initial adolescent. Chapter 264, New Home. After using several extractors to test the can, Nick reached a conclusion. The can was most likely a mid-adolescent. It managed to break Trevor's toe, but it also hit the wall with a lot of force, scratching its outside. Luckily, the dents and scratches vanished after a couple of hours. The next few days were not the happiest for the extractors. A great number of them had broken toes, since Nick experimented on the can using his employees. Luckily, peak newbies could recover from a broken toe within 2 weeks thanks to their faster regeneration. Nick only needed about 3 days to recover. After some days, Nick finally finished experimenting on the can. First, he gave it the official designation of the can. The can produced Zephyx according to the number and strength of broken toes. If Nick broke a toe, it produced around 50 grams of Zephyx. If an initial John broke their toe, it produced about 10 grams. There was no hard limit on how many times someone could work with the can. The only limit was the number of remaining healthy toes and the health of the can itself. The can could be kicked by thousands of people, thousands of times a day, without taking damage. However, after Trevor sacrificed his toes, it became clear that mid-Johns could only kick the can a maximum of 3 times a day before its condition became too damaged. In the end, Nick decided not to assign anyone to the can. Instead, he made working with it an option for every extractor at Dark Dream. Forcing someone to regularly break one of their bones wasn't something Nick was comfortable with. Even though breaking one's toes while kicking a can could seem humorous, it was legitimately painful. So Nick left the can open. If anyone wanted to advance faster in level and earn extra Zephyx, they were allowed to work with it. However, their assigned duties couldn't suffer as a result. In the beginning, almost everyone worked with the can at least once. It was a couple thousand credits for one kick. But over the weeks, things calmed down. In the end, only a couple of extractors regularly kicked the can. Those were the ones who wanted to grow stronger quickly. With the addition of the can, Dark Dream now had 12 Specters. Dark Dream had grown a lot. 12 Specters, 24 Zephyx Extractors, 50 investigators, over 30 clerks, 25 guards. Dark Dream had over 120 employees. There were so many employees that Nick even started to have trouble remembering all the names. Eventually, he only focused on remembering the names of the Zephyx Extractors. As Nick walked home, he sighed. He felt like he was shirking his responsibilities by not remembering all the names. Of course, he knew it wasn't his responsibility to know every employee's name, but he still felt like he wasn't doing his best. Nick walked east for a couple of minutes. Naturally, he no longer lived in the hotel across the street from the old warehouse. After a while of walking, Nick reached his home. At the edge between the outer city and the Dregs was a 2-story house made of metal. While all the metal in the surroundings was rusty, the metal the house was made of wasn't. The house also looked beautiful and clean. In fact, it looked even better than the average house in the outer city. Nick had commissioned this house about 2 years ago. Naturally, with his status and wealth, Nick could splurge a lot. For example, the house was made of steel instead of ordinary metal. Steel was so hard that even a peak newbie couldn't break through it with just their fists. Nick could damage it, but he needed to actually try. However, that wasn't the expensive part of the house. As Nick reached home, he jumped up and landed on the roof. From there, he could see his backyard. It was over 50 meters long and wide, and the floor was made of stainless steel. This was the expensive part of the house. While no one needed to buy space in the Dregs, this location was too close to the outer city. Every month, Nick had to pay a couple thousand credits to the city for his backyard, but that barely tickled him. By now, Nick earned almost 1 million credits per month. He earned more than 90% of the people in the lower layer of the inner city. But he didn't care much about that. Nick's focus was still on his own power and dark dreams. The more powerful he and Dark Dream became, the more they could do to improve people's lives. After a few breaths, Nick jumped into his backyard. At the moment, it was filled with several huge pieces of rusty metal. Nick had been using these pieces as punching bags. Sadly, most had become too damaged to use, which meant Nick had to clean his backyard now. After landing, he grabbed one of the pieces to move it. The piece was surprisingly heavy. Usually, he could just throw them aside. That was when Nick realized his ability hadn't reactivated. It was normal for Nick's ability to deactivate while he walked home or stood on his roof, but it always reactivated once he was in his backyard. After all, it was surrounded by big steel walls. It was very unusual for his ability to still be deactivated inside his backyard. Nick quickly looked around. No one was on top of his steel walls. No one was in his backyard. Then Nick looked at his house. Someone is definitely here, and the fact that they haven't greeted me yet means they're not here just to talk. Chapter 265, Shots. Is it a Specter or a human? Nick thought. Is it one of Envy's servants? If so, I have to escape immediately. Luckily, nothing had happened yet. Another lucky thing was that Nick always carried all his weapons. By now, Nick's strength had grown so great he could throw his heavy spears like sticks. Nick smoothly drew one of his spears and held it ready. No one has attacked me yet, Nick thought as he covertly glanced around his backyard. Slowly, he started to circle one of the big piles of rusty metal. Silence. The entire backyard was silent, except for the sound of Nick's steps. When Nick reached the other side of the heap of metal, his ability still hadn't deactivated. They're not looking at me from above. The walls are behind me. The floor has no openings. That means they're seeing me through the heap of metal. Well, this is as good a time as any, Nick thought, narrowing his eyes. About 2 years ago, Nick had decided to wear a uniform with an added red coat extending to his knees. Manufacturers were allowed to produce these uniforms due to popular demand. The reason many manufacturers wore them was the ability to keep weapons and useful trinkets secret. The uniform naturally also came with an advanced, practical tool belt. Nick covertly moved his free hand to the back of his pants, adrenaline flooding his body. Crack! Nick heard the extremely subtle sound of leather boots scraping against steel from the other side of the heap of metal. Up until now, there hadn't been a single sound, and the chances of one of Nick's attackers slipping up were minuscule. This meant the other side was getting agitated. They were most likely about to attack, and the thought made them subconsciously tighten their grip on their weapons and lower their stance, producing the sound. That little sound told Nick his opponent was most likely human, which he hadn't expected. There was no reason to attack Dark Dream. The city had no reason to, since they could simply disband Dark Dream if they wanted. Blitz had no interest since Vernon Melfian stood behind Dark Dream's CEO. And the other manufacturers wouldn't attack either, since they didn't want to start beef with Vernon. Even more, Dark Dream kept to itself and didn't antagonize any of the manufacturers. So why would a human want to attack the chief Zephyx Extractor of Dark Dream? Sadly, now wasn't the time to think about this. As soon as Nick heard the sound, he pulled a black ball from behind his back and threw it at the ground with all his power. Whoom! An explosion of smoke consumed Nick and a huge part of his backyard. A smoke bomb. Bang, 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 bang. Immediately, a barrage of bullets punched through the heaps of iron. While normal guns couldn't break through so much iron, these were definitely not normal guns. Based on their power, they were wielded by at least a mid-John. These guns used an Extractor's Zephyx as propulsion, and sometimes as ammunition too. The bullets left holes in the huge heap of iron, and Nick could tell the projectiles flying past him carried quite a bit of Zephyx. That meant whoever fired the gun had an ability that let them enchant their bullets. Another thing Nick noticed was that all the bullets aimed below his chest, which was strange. If the goal was to kill Nick, they want to hit his chest or head. Yet the bullets aimed for his lower abdomen and legs. They don't want to kill me, Nick thought, furrowing his brows as he jumped aside. Naturally, he had expected to be attacked right after using his smoke bomb, which was why he'd already jumped aside. All the fire is coming through the heap of metal, and the Zephyx on the bullets seems similar. That means only one person is shooting at me. Not sure if they're using a rapid-fire gun or 2 guns at once, though. Ding! One of the bullets was about to hit Nick's leg, but then a small green force field appeared. Naturally, with his wealth, Nick had bought a far better barrier than his old, trashy one. This one stayed perpetually active, using a negligible amount of Zephyx to stay ready. The barrier also encompassed his body at a distance of about 10 centimeters. This way, it wouldn't waste Zephyx blocking attacks that would have missed Nick anyway. It was far better than his old one. Sadly, it was still worlds away from Wintour's and Artem's barriers. For example, it didn't cling to his skin perfectly, and it couldn't reshape itself to redirect attacks or diminish their force. Naturally, it also lacked any of the fancy features Artem's barrier had. When the bullet hit Nick's barrier, its green light took on a slightly black tone. That's the Zephyx on the bullets, probably some kind of debilitating or poisoning effect, Nick thought. I feel some drain on my Zephyx, but it's manageable. That probably means they're a late or peak John. That's someone I can kill. But is the gunner the only attacker, or are there more? Nick thought. Finally, Nick landed over 5 meters to the side, away from the lump of rusty metal. Yet when he landed, Nick seemed to collapse into himself. His body turned into mist and slithered rapidly forward, close to the ground. Right now, Nick was at the northern edge of his backyard, with his house at the southern edge. The shots had come from the direction of his house, and Nick was slithering toward the northwestern corner of the backyard. Step, step. But then Nick heard steps ahead of him, moving toward the place where he'd just been. They're not alone, Nick thought, narrowing his eyes. This was troublesome. There could be two. There could also be 200. Chapter 266, Specter K. Nick silently slithered aside and looked toward the steps. The smoke was dense, but it was still possible to see rough shapes 1 or 2 meters away. The steps were loud and powerful, meaning the person was charging forward with all their power. If the gunner was a strong extractor, this was probably someone of equal power, moving at over 60 kph. Nick had to make a quick decision. Observe or attack. Nick narrowed his eyes, and his fog-like body compressed. An outline of his body appeared, crouched and ready to explode forward. However, since Nick was made of fog, he still wasn't perceivable. Smoke and fog looked very similar. By now, the sounds of shots had vanished. Nick planted his right foot on the steel wall of his backyard, looking forward with focused, narrowed eyes. Then, a faint outline of a running person. Boom! Nick turned corporeal and exploded forward with all his power. Naturally, since no one could see him, his ability was active. With his athletic body and his ability, Nick had the physical power of a late veteran right now. Yet even though he used unreal strength to shoot forward, the only visible effect on the wall was a light gust of wind from the spot his foot had touched. Meanwhile, Nick exploded forward at unreal speed, his right arm pulled back. It was almost like his target was standing still. Nick punched forward with his right arm, the blade already extended. Bang! An orange glow appeared in front of the blade and quickly broke into shards and splinters. Nick felt his ability deactivate at that point, but it didn't matter. The kinetic force had already been created. Shing! Nick's blade easily went through the side of the figure's head. If they were human, they were definitely dead. And sure enough, Nick's ability immediately reactivated. Since the force of his jump wasn't yet spent, Nick flew into his opponent's upper body. The two of them fell, but Nick used his left hand to catch himself in the body silently. In a fluid motion, Nick rolled forward, pulling the corpse over himself until it was in front of him. Bang! And he kicked it east, toward the northeastern corner of his backyard. Boom! A second later, the sound of a loud crash came from that corner. Nick did this to make the enemy think he was fighting someone there, close to where the battle had started. Meanwhile, Nick jumped west again, turning into fog that slithered across the ground. A second later, he reached the edge of the smoke, around 5 meters from the western wall. In fog form, Nick glanced around the western side of his backyard. He couldn't see anyone. The next moment, he materialized again in a crouch. Bang! And jumped diagonally forward as hard as he could. With Nick's power, jumping over 50 meters wasn't difficult. Like a cannonball, Nick shot diagonally past the wall of his backyard. He was doing the smartest thing, running away. He didn't know who was attacking him, and the top priority was to survive, not kill his enemy. Even more, this was an ambush, and fighting in the middle of one was stupid. He had to reset the battlefield to neutral ground. While flying through the air, Nick felt his ability deactivate again. He quickly looked around and saw someone watching him outside his backyard. This person was probably insurance, meant to catch Nick if he escaped his backyard. If there's one guy in the west, there's probably another in the north and another in the south. There might be even more, Nick thought. Together with the gunner and the dead one, that makes at least 5 people. The person was cloaked in a gray mantle that almost perfectly matched the gray of Nick's walls. The only identifying feature was the long spear in their hands. Nick barely glimpsed their face as their eyes met, but he could tell it was a man, and he didn't seem scared. But then Nick's attention was pulled forward. White gas gathered in front of his jumping path. Seeing that, Nick gnashed his teeth. A Specter cage, he thought with frustration. Naturally, when big manufacturers intended to capture a powerful Specter, they often readied Specter cages. These devices looked like big steel boxes. If placed somewhere, given a lot of Zephyx, and activated, they projected a powerful barrier in a circle at a set distance. If anything approached the barrier, it would gather Zephyx at that spot and harden it. There were only 3 ways to break through such a barrier. First, destroy the steel box in the middle of the cage, projecting the barrier. Second, attack the barrier until all its Zephyx is used up. The more it had to block, the more Zephyx it used. Third, unleash an attack so powerful the barrier can't block it. Sadly, that was generally viewed as impossible, since Specter cages were built to withstand a lot of power. In the end, one thing was certain. Nick was stuck here until he got rid of the Specter cage. Whoever wants to kill me is willing to spend kilos upon kilos of Zephyx, Nick realized. As Nick was about to reach the barrier, the person on the ground shouted something. "He's over here." Nick gritted his teeth. Chapter 267, West to East. Bang! Nick landed on the hardened Zephyx of the Specter cage, legs first. With one glance, he took in the battlefield. Half of his backyard was covered in smoke. Specter cage surrounded his house and backyard. A person with a spear stood below him, having just alerted everyone to his position. The next moment, Nick readied one of his spears and threw it at the person below with all his power, his body pushing into the barrier from the force of the throw. Nick had never stopped practicing with his spears, and even with an awkward angle and position, he still threw with a lot of power and accuracy. Bang! However, the person below simply jumped aside, avoiding the attack, and Nick's spear shot through the floor into the sewers. Nick narrowed his eyes. Bang! Then he jumped toward his house, behind the guy on the ground. Bang! The guy immediately jumped upward, spear pointed at Nick, ready to intercept him. Nick's eyes shone, and his right arm pulled upward with a lot of force. Bang! His spear shot out of the ground as he yanked it back with his ghost wire. The next moment, the guy thrust his spear at Nick's torso. But then his eyes widened in shock. Nick's trajectory had changed. He was much lower than expected. That was from Nick pulling his spear back with all his power while flying. For every action, an equal and opposite reaction. Nick barely flew below the spear and pointed his blade at the guy's torso. Bang! A yellow barrier appeared in Nick's path. The man's face turned white, but the barrier held. After all, Nick's ability hadn't been active. However, the barrier apparently didn't absorb kinetic energy. Nick's forward momentum halted completely, leaving him stationary in the air for an instant while the guy's body shot into the distance, toward Nick's house. Bang! The guy's barrier activated again as he hit the house, denting the wall. At that moment, Nick saw the barrier flickering, a sign it was nearly out of Zephyx. Even though Nick hadn't killed him, the guy was likely out of the fight, since moving without Zephyx was nearly impossible. The stronger an extractor became, the more their body relied on Zephyx, and without it, moving grew very difficult. As Nick watched the man tumble down the side of his house, he noticed a small gleam of light from one of the windows. Boom! Nick's green barrier appeared in front of him, blocking an extremely long, dense bullet. The next moment, Nick felt like someone had punched him in the chest, and the deafening sound of a huge sniper rifle rang out from his house. This was the feeling of losing a huge amount of Zephyx in an instant. That's a different person, Nick realized, gritting his teeth, not the gunner from earlier. The difference in power between the earlier gunner and this one was huge. However, judging by the sound and the bullet, this gunner wasn't stronger. They simply unleashed much more power in one shot. The gunner probably spent something like 50% of their Zephyx on this shot. And that wasn't even everything. Nick's barrier canceled kinetic energy. This meant Nick was still in midair, just starting to fall. He was a sitting duck. Nick quickly grabbed one of his spears and performed a hip throw. The spear shot through the window where the sniper was supposed to be. Nick didn't expect the throw to hit. The sniper had probably retreated immediately after firing, but Nick wanted to make sure. If they stayed and fired again, Nick might die. After throwing his spear, Nick cut the ghost wire. He didn't want to reveal his position by pulling it back. The hip throw sent him toward the barrier again. After landing, he angled downward and jumped diagonally toward the ground. Just before diving past the neighboring roofs, he saw two people jump onto the wall of his backyard. One came from the north, one from the east. Those were probably the two guarding those sides. For an instant, Nick's ability deactivated, but it quickly reactivated. Bang! Surprisingly, Nick didn't cushion his fall this time, and he shot through the metallic grates on the ground, landing on the barrier of the Specter cage. The Specter cage projected a spherical barrier, meaning it extended below ground too. Nick quickly pulled something from his tool belt and crushed it in his hand. An instant later, it began shining brightly like the sun, and Nick tucked it into a pocket on the chest of his uniform. The light shone through the pocket, though it was now subdued. Nick had met the nightmare more than once during important battles and had decided to invest in this trinket. It was essentially an arclight but round. Nick jumped forward with all his power. With his ability active, he could cross the entire Specter cage in one jump. 3 seconds later, Nick landed below ground on the eastern side of the cage. The next moment, he rammed his blade into the floor above him and cut a hole through it. Then he grabbed the arclight from his pocket and threw it into the sewer water. The Specter cage encompassed quite a lot of sewer water below it as well. Nick had thrown the arclight into the water since it was very noticeable on him. The black sewer water immediately swallowed its light, and Nick jumped out of the sewers. Now he was outside the eastern wall of his backyard, while everyone rushed toward the west. Chapter 268, House. As soon as Nick surfaced again, he saw someone. A tall man stood on top of the eastern wall of Nick's backyard. Luckily, the guy was looking west, his back turned to Nick. With narrowed eyes, Nick saw a throwing spear in the guy's right hand and a couple more on his back. It seemed this was one of the few people who chose throwing spears, just like Nick. Nick quickly thought about how to take him down unnoticed. A bit later, he grabbed 3 of his spears and carefully, silently stabbed them through the ground behind him. Then he ran forward and jumped with all his power. With his ability active, Nick jumped at the person on the wall with incredible power, his right arm extended. Bang! The orange barrier appeared and broke apart before Nick's blade entered the back of the guy's head. For an instant, Nick's ability deactivated, but it quickly reactivated. The next moment, the 3 ghost wires went taut as the spear's sides pushed against the ground. Nick's body stopped in the air behind the guy. He pulled his blade from the guy's head, grabbed him, and pulled himself back. The corpse and Nick sank behind the eastern wall of the backyard. Thanks to his ability, Nick could tell nobody had seen this, probably because everyone was busy running and looking west. Nick would have loved to examine the corpse and find out who was attacking him, but he didn't have time. Someone might have already noticed the hole he'd made in the west, and staying in one spot too long was extremely dangerous now. Nick quickly smashed the corpse into a random ruined house and ran south. His biggest strength in this situation was his incredible speed. With his ability, Nick could run as fast as a late veteran. In barely a second, he reached the northeastern corner of his house, also the southeastern corner of his backyard. Nick turned to Fog, climbed the corner, and peeped over the wall. He didn't like what he saw. 5 people stood at the western wall of his backyard, 2 of them mid-jump over it. The sniper isn't among them. That means at least 10 people total in this ambush, and as far as I can tell, all mid-Johns at least, Nick thought, gritting his teeth. That was a huge number of people just to kill Nick. He's not in the west, fan out and defend. Nick heard someone shouting from beyond the wall. Based on the authority in his voice, ordering everyone around, he's probably the leader, Nick thought. He remembered the person who jumped over the northern wall when the man in the west shouted earlier. He hadn't seen that person among the 5 currently in the backyard. The guy who guarded the north is most likely the leader, and he's currently west of my backyard. The next moment, Nick turned corporeal, grabbed something from his tool belt, and threw it into the backyard. Boom! The smoke bomb exploded at the northwestern corner, engulfing nearly everyone in the backyard in a cloud of smoke. He's here, someone inside shouted. However, Nick hadn't entered the backyard. He'd only thrown the smoke bomb there to make them think he had. Instead, Nick jumped to the eastern wall of his house and turned to Fog. Naturally, since this was Nick's house, it had a couple of nice additions that normal people wouldn't recognize for what they were. Every house in the outer city had light holes, since people didn't want to get attacked by the nightmare. However, Nick's house had bigger ones. Its light holes were over 10 centimeters wide, though fewer in number. Normal people would just think it a stylistic choice. But in truth, these holes made it easy and convenient for Nick to move room to room in his fog state. Moving through a slit or small hole cost a lot of Zephyx and took a while, but moving through such big holes was barely an issue. Nick easily entered through one and slithered across the ceiling of the first floor. He rapidly moved from room to room, passing through big light holes near the ceiling. Some seconds later, he finally found his target. In one of the rooms on the second floor, Nick saw a gray-haired young woman with a huge rifle. She was looking at the backyard. Nick materialized behind her, pulled his arm back, and threw a hook punch. The blade of his arm hit her orange barrier, which shattered instantly. Bang! Her head separated from her shoulders and shattered against the steel wall. That made a lot of noise, and Nick was sure everyone had noticed. But before they could turn to look at the house, Nick and the corpse had already vanished from the window. The headless corpse lay below the window, and Nick slithered through the light holes near the ground. Bang! The front door shot open as someone kicked it in, and Nick saw the person entering with shock. Wait, isn't that the guy who ran out of Zephyx after I punched him in the west? Nick thought. Yes, it was the guy Nick had thrown against the house. Yet here he was, storming in with a lot of energy, as if he hadn't lost any Zephyx at all. Nick decided against engaging him, since that might take too long. Everyone else was probably already running toward the house, and Nick had to leave. So he slithered out of his house. Luckily, the guy was too busy charging toward the second floor to notice the small cloud of fog in the room. Chapter 269, Different Perspective. After Nick slithered out of his house, he saw someone carefully running toward it from outside. He hadn't seen that person before. It was a petite figure with a gun, a couple of green strands of hair poking out from her cloak. Most likely a woman. She came from where the guy landed earlier. Is she why he recovered so quickly? Does she have some kind of healing ability? Nick thought. The woman was too busy running into the house behind the other guy to notice the cloud of fog clinging to the outside wall on the second floor. Nick rapidly jumped over her and landed on the ground behind her. As she reached the entrance, Nick materialized in a crouch behind her. Boom! Her barrier materialized and broke apart. This time, Nick was careful not to make too much noise. Instead of using all his power to bury his blade in her skull, he grabbed her hair through her cloak, pulled her head back, and buried his blade in her neck. It took half a second longer than normal, but she died silently. Next, Nick ran west of his house and came around the corner. And his ability deactivated. Just 5 meters ahead stood the guy from the north, the probable leader of the ambush. Their eyes met. Nick couldn't fully see the guy's face, but for some reason he felt familiar. Nick felt like he'd seen this guy before. The man immediately pulled his spear back and assumed a defensive stance, his empty left arm in front of him. However, instead of attacking as the guy expected, Nick turned around and vanished behind the corner again. He's south of the house, the guy shouted, running after him. He passed the corner and Nick was gone. But the guy knew where Nick had gone. He was an experienced fighter, and the gust of wind he just felt almost certainly came from a strong jump. He looked up and saw only the white of the Specter cage slowly fading, meaning something had just been near it. Had Nick jumped to the barrier and over the house toward the backyard, in the single second it took the leader to shout and round the corner. That would take an insane level of speed. This ambush was not going as planned. This fucker was unreasonably slippery. He's on top of the building, the leader shouted. Bang, bang. The sound of gunshots came from the backyard. He crouched and jumped to the roof of the house. Yet when he arrived, he saw nobody. The leader gritted his teeth and ran to the northern edge of the roof, facing the backyard. But when he saw the backyard, he had to take a deep breath in shock. Samara, he whispered. Someone's body lay on the northern wall of Nick's backyard, impaled by a spear through the head. Beside the corpse lay 2 black guns. East, someone in the backyard shouted, and 2 cloaked people ran toward the eastern wall. The leader narrowed his eyes and ran east too. He was far faster than everyone else, and even though the 2 from the backyard started earlier, he arrived first. What greeted him was a huge cloud of smoke covering the area east of the backyard. The leader and the 2 others quickly searched the area. There's a hole, someone shouted. The leader reached the spot and saw a big hole in the ground. At that moment, he realized what had happened at the start. Nick must have run from west to east after escaping the initial ambush. That was how he'd gotten into the house. Then the leader's eyes widened, as he realized the target must have just done the same thing in reverse. Even worse, they'd wasted nearly 5 seconds searching for Nick in the smoke. Jillian, disperse the smoke in the east. Everyone else, he's coming from the west, the leader shouted. Coming, a deep voice shouted from inside the backyard. Boom! But then the leader and the 2 beside him heard a loud bang from the wall of the backyard. The 3 ran toward it, and the leader saw a bloody spear poking out of the eastern wall. He knew very well what was on the other side. The leader felt the situation slipping out of control. He had to regain control immediately. Everyone assemble in the center of the backyard. The leader shouted with all his power, his voice booming through the surroundings. Meanwhile, he jumped over the wall and landed in the middle of the backyard. The two who had accompanied him east quickly arrived at his side. Bang! The sound of something powerful hitting, something thundered out of the house. The two beside the leader immediately charged south. Stop! They immediately stopped moving at their leader's order. This entire mess had started with them, chasing their target's tail like a cat. The leader wouldn't make the same mistake again. He stepped between the two of them. Follow me closely, we can't afford to get separated. They nodded. Until now, the two had been locked onto their target with tunnel vision, not noticing their surroundings. Only now did they realize how bad the situation truly was. Their leader had called for everyone to gather in the backyard, but they were the only ones there. 3 people total, including the leader. That meant their target had killed 8 of their colleagues. What the fuck were they fighting? Chapter 270, Scattering. Nick watched the 3 remaining people slowly walking toward his house. Right now, Nick was in fog form inside one of the heaps of rusted metal in his backyard. 11 people in total, huh? He thought, watching them with narrowed eyes. For a while, Nick just watched. They stayed constantly alert and didn't dare split apart. Nick could attempt killing one with a spear throw, but decided against it. That sniper shot and the 3 shots I took from the gunner already cost me over 80% of my Zephyx, he thought. Entering battle in my state is stupid. I have to remember I'm still outnumbered, and the strongest of them is still alive. From what I could tell, all the assassins have been peak Johns, and the leader is most likely a veteran. If he were alone, I might try it, but not with the 2 beside him. Nick watched them carefully enter his house, and he slowly slithered from one heap of metal to the next. I think it should be here, Nick thought, searching through the rusted heap. Then he found it. At the bottom of the heap was a black steel box with several buttons. The Specter cage, Nick thought. He came out the northern side of the heap and moved to another one. He glanced at the building. Nobody there. The next moment, Nick materialized and threw a spear at the heap of metal hiding the Specter cage. Boom! The spear shot through the metal and sank into the sewers. Since Nick wanted to keep his location secret, he'd cut the spear's ghost wire. The next moment, a huge burst of Zephyx exploded out of the heap, and the barrier surrounding Nick's home vanished. Meanwhile, the 3 people inside the house ran out, and feeling the huge burst of Zephyx in the backyard, they knew what had happened. They had failed. They hadn't been able to catch Nick inside a cage. How could they catch him outside one? The leader gritted his teeth and took a deep breath. Mission failure. Get rid of the evidence before the guards show up, he ordered. The leader retrieved some kind of device. The 2 beside him pulled out round objects and handed them to him. The 3 jumped over the backyard wall and ran east for a couple of seconds. The leader pressed a couple of buttons on the round objects and pocketed them. Then he pressed a button on the device. Boom, boom, boom. 8 powerful explosions tore through Nick's distant home. Huge chunks of his steel walls blew off, and the house itself was blown to pieces. The round objects the 2 had handed their leader were bombs. In case of failure, they'd be used to destroy the evidence. At most, the guards would find scraps of Zephyx and metal. Naturally, everyone had also been forbidden from carrying anything that could be linked to them or their employer. The 3 threw one last glance at the resting place of their 8 colleagues before running east. They zigzagged through alleys, jumping and running through houses. Suddenly only 2 were left, but they weren't worried. They split up to designated positions. After all, if Nick talked to the guards, he'd say 3 cloaked people had attacked him and were now fleeing. So they split up while shedding their cloaks. Suddenly, only the leader remained. For several minutes, he kept running at full speed while subtly altering his appearance. Eventually, he became indistinguishable from a random citizen of the Dregs. He'd travel through public places now, mingling with people. Only once he was completely certain did he slowly restore his real appearance. Eventually, he walked toward the inner city. His bored eyes swept the entrance and the guards beside it. "Sir, please wait a moment," one of the guards said. "What?" the leader asked, bored. "Sorry to disturb you, but something happened in the outer city, and we're supposed to investigate every level 2 and level 3 extractor coming from there," the guard said respectfully. "What's this about?" the leader asked. The chief Zephyx Extractor of Dark Dream was attacked by several level 2 extractors and a level 3 extractor. Do you know anything about this? The guard asked. I heard the commotion, but I thought it was just a battle between some gangs, the leader said, bored. Where were you the last 2 hours? The guard asked. I was meeting the head of my investigation department, the leader said with annoyance. Any witnesses? The guard asked. Almost my entire investigation department saw me, the leader said calmly. All right, thank you for cooperating, the guard said. One last thing. The guard pointed at somebody sitting on the ground with their head lowered. Do you know this person? The guard asked. The leader furrowed his brows, walked forward, and lifted the body's head by the hair. It was a corpse, one of the 2 who had fled with the leader. It seemed Nick had followed them, killed them, and brought them to the guard. Merger Mender, the leader said. He quit our company around 4 months ago. I've seen him on the streets here and there, but haven't talked to him since. Sir, we'd like to talk more about this at the station. I know it wasn't you, but we have to follow every lead. Knowing one of the culprits sadly makes you a suspect, the guard said carefully. The leader nodded. I get it, lead the way. He wasn't really worried. Everything for today had been meticulously planned. There were tons of witnesses who could give him an alibi. Also, no one would expect him to personally go out and kill some level 2 extractor. After all, he was Callum Sondur, chief Zephyx Extractor of the Spartans. Chapter 271, Frustrating. The atmosphere in the meeting room was solemn, and the 4 people in attendance were silent. Nick had just told Wintour, Jenny, and Trevor what happened yesterday evening. For the rest of yesterday, Nick had stayed with the guards. After the assailants left, he had followed one of them. He would have liked to follow the leader, but decided security mattered more than a potential high-risk, high-reward gain. So he'd followed one of the other 2 instead. Then he'd faced another choice: kill the guy right away and keep his body as evidence, or follow him further. Since someone with that power almost certainly lived in the inner city, Nick decided to kill him immediately. He wouldn't be able to stalk and kill him there without proof. Even more, Nick was certain the enemy had already prepared for possible failure, meaning everyone probably had alibis. So Nick decided to use the lack of witnesses to his advantage. He killed the guy, brought his corpse to the guards, and told them he'd killed him during the battle, not after it. Naturally, that was a lie, but the only way to disprove it was for the real perpetrator to step forward and say Nick was lying. Obviously, the enemy wouldn't do that. After delivering the corpse to the guards, they immediately mobilized to investigate everything. However, Nick knew the investigation wouldn't produce concrete results. Skirmishes between manufacturers happened from time to time, but almost all were kept secret. Most of the time, both sides had something to hide, and if the guards got involved, the victim's secrets might come to light, troublesome for everyone. Additionally, they likely wouldn't find much. Yet Dark Dream was about as honest as a manufacturer could be. They didn't hide any Specters, and they didn't hide any of their people. The only shady thing they did was trade with the parasite occasionally. Because of that, Dark Dream wasn't afraid to involve the guards. After several hours, the guards had compiled a list of every powerful extractor in the outer city during the attack. There had been surprisingly many. It turned out the market for newbies had been open that evening, with a couple of events besides. Over 10 veterans had been in the outer city during the attack, and with nothing else to go on, the guards couldn't make an arrest. After all, only one of the 10 had actually been part of the attack. They couldn't arrest all of them. Even more, since Nick belonged to a manufacturer and was even its chief Zephyx Extractor, things grew complicated. What if the guards gathered the veterans and Nick claimed one from a rival manufacturer had attacked him, even if they hadn't been involved at all? Sometimes it was more profitable to let the real attacker go, while taking down someone innocent instead. For example, what if Dark Dream decided to blame the chief Zephyx Extractor of the Spartans? That could completely destabilize the Spartans and cost them their footing. Naturally, as the victim, Dark Dream would likely get some, if not all, of their Specters. It was always risky to trust victims when they were executives, and the perpetrator was a rival. After spending the day and night working with the guards, Nick returned to Dark Dream and immediately called a meeting. When he finished relaying the information, the room fell silent. Trevor looked at Nick with narrowed eyes. Naturally, he wasn't angry at Nick, but for him. Jenny could only grit her teeth in frustration. Wintour stared at the table with furrowed brows, deep in thought. How did you do it? Trevor asked after a while, concerned. Do what? Nick asked neutrally. Win against so many powerful people, Trevor said. You said there were 10 peak Johns and even a veteran. Not only were you outnumbered 11-1, they got the drop on you. No matter how much I think about it, I can't imagine anyone getting out of that alive, Trevor said. Jenny looked at Nick too. Naturally, she wanted to know as well. I can't tell you, Nick said. It's related to my power. Even after all these years, neither Trevor nor Jenny knew about Nick's power. Only 3 people in the entire city knew: Wintour, Albert, and Julian. The people at Ghosty's lab only knew his power was strange, not the specifics. Is your ability that powerful? Trevor asked. Wintour shot Trevor an annoyed glance. As CEO, he too had a vested interest in keeping Nick's power secret. However, Wintour didn't reprimand Trevor, still busy puzzling over several things himself. In the right circumstances, it's very powerful, Nick said, but in the wrong circumstances, it's almost useless. That's why it's so important to keep the circumstances secret. If someone knows how my power works, it might become completely useless, Nick explained. Trevor could only sigh. Sorry for asking such personal questions, boss, he said. It's just so frustrating. Nick raised an eyebrow as Trevor continued. We constantly see you doing things that are unimaginably difficult and dangerous. You dealt with Cycle on your own while we just looked on, cowering inside the warehouse. You captured the fog while we were just waiting. You brought the glasses and the money synced to Dark Dream after some kind of incident while we did our day-to-day work. And now you survived an overwhelmingly powerful ambush while we were resting at home. Trevor sighed again. I just feel superfluous. Chapter 272, The Perpetrator. Nick scratched the back of his head. I mean, I see where you're coming from, but there isn't much I can do about that, he said. I couldn't have known about this ambush. If I had, I would have brought you two with me. At that, Nick furrowed his brows. A thought struck him. Yes, he would have brought Jenny and Trevor, but would that have actually improved the outcome? With Nick constantly moving, the enemy couldn't fully use their numbers, but if Jenny and Trevor had been there, they could have. The enemy would probably have killed Jenny and Trevor with their overwhelming numbers advantage, and Nick, realizing the danger, would likely have grown too nervous to attack an enemy without being certain of the kill. Nick's expression turned awkward and sympathetic. Honestly, if I'd brought the two of them, I might have died, he thought. Trevor noticed Nick's expression shift. Trevor was a pretty intelligent guy, and he had an inkling of what Nick might be thinking. Let's drop this topic, Wintour said suddenly. We have more important things to discuss. Trevor and Jenny looked at Wintour and sighed. Right, there were more important things to discuss. Nick, any idea why another manufacturer would want you dead? Wintour asked, turning to Nick. No matter how I look at it, there's no valid reason to attack you. It's not the city, they need to stay neutral. It's definitely not Blitz. Anatomy and Ghosty's lab are too big to care about Dark Dream. They wouldn't want to offend my father over a couple of adolescents. Gemini is very secure right now and needs to consolidate after acquiring their elder. They also wouldn't want to offend Blitz. Solace wants an elder, not more adolescents. Only their lack of an elder keeps them in the lower levels, and using their resources for anything else would be a huge waste. And the Spartans can't afford to fight us for even more reasons. They just got their first adult and need to consolidate like Gemini. On top of that, the strength gap between us isn't huge, which would make a fight troublesome. No matter how I think about it, I can't find any reason a manufacturer would attack you. It doesn't matter who it is. It would be a dumb decision for any of them, Wintour explained. Nick looked at the table, brows furrowed. There were 4 important pieces of information Wintour didn't know. First, Wintour didn't know Simon Francium had tasked Nick with finding Envy's captured servant in Crimson Fungus City. While the details of Nick's talk with Simon were unknown, people knew Nick had talked to a protector. What if the manufacturer suppressing Envy's servant grew suspicious of Nick? That would be reason enough to kill him. Second, Nick hadn't mentioned one important detail. He hadn't forgotten how the first hail of bullets from the gunner had aimed at his legs and lower abdomen. Even the sniper bullet targeted his lower torso. This meant the enemy didn't want to kill Nick. They wanted to capture him alive, which led to the third piece of information Nick had kept from Wintour. This entire business with Envy. Wintour didn't know Envy wanted to capture Nick. With these 3 pieces, Nick could already tell who the mastermind was. Envy, or more precisely Envy's servant. If Envy were here personally, it could probably stroll into the city, kill everyone and grab Nick. So it couldn't be Envy itself, only its servant. Nick was over 95% sure this was the doing of one of Envy's servants. Sadly, a few questions remained. Envy's servant had to be extremely powerful. Capturing Nick shouldn't be difficult. So why didn't it grab Nick on its own? Why use Extractors? And if Envy's servant could manipulate Extractors to such a degree, why not directly manipulate Dark Dream's own? Finally, there was one more thing Nick kept secret. He already knew who the Extractors belonged to. The guards had shared their findings, including the list of veterans found in the outer city and the identity of the corpse Nick had handed over. That corpse had once belonged to the Spartans. Even more, the chief Zephyx Extractor of the Spartans had been in the outer city. Nick also remembered the spear in the leader's hand and his battle stance. Lastly, when Nick saw Callum Saunders' name, his face came to mind. Though it had been hard to see the leader's face under his cloak, Nick had seen enough to say the ambush leader and Callum Saunders looked very similar in both aura and appearance. Nick was 98% certain he'd been attacked by the Spartans. One of Envy's servants must have entered the city, and instead of grabbing Nick itself, infiltrated the Spartans and somehow made them attack him. Did the Specter control their minds, offer a favorable trade? Nick couldn't be sure of the specifics. They attacked me once and failed, Nick thought, brows furrowed. I'm not sure they'll try again. There has to be a reason Envy's servant can't directly enter Dark Dream. Okay, assuming something or someone in Dark Dream keeps Envy's servant at bay, what could they do to get to me? They could try to directly grab me, which is what they did yesterday. But there's also something else they can do. Destroy Dark Dream. If you can't get someone out of the house, why not destroy the house itself? Chapter 273, I Trust You. Nick, you've been silent a while, Winter said. Nick looked at him and sighed. I don't know, he said. Winter furrowed his brows. Trevor and Jenny also looked at Nick with uncertainty. Nick was not a good liar. After a while, Winter sighed. Meeting adjourned. I'll give new orders later, he said. Jenny and Trevor exchanged a glance, conflict visible in their eyes. They knew what Winter meant. Sadly, there was nothing they could do about it. In the end, they stood, said their goodbyes and left the room. Yet neither Nick nor Winter stood up. Nick avoided Winter's eyes, while Winter watched him with a furious, penetrating gaze. Can you tell me now? Winter asked, anger repressed. Nick felt quite uncomfortable. I know who the perpetrator is, Nick said, but I can't tell you why it's them. Winter slowly closed his eyes and took a deep breath to calm his anger. Okay, he said after a moment, then tell me what you can. Nick didn't feel great either. He felt he should tell Winter, but knew it would likely end in his own death. Sure, Winter and Nick were great friends, but Nick didn't think Winter would sacrifice his life for him. I saw the face of their leader during the battle, Nick said. Together with the guard's report, everything points to one target. The Spartans. Winter narrowed his eyes. How certain are you? Very certain, Nick answered. The leader of the ambush was their chief Zephyx Extractor, Callum Saunders. He was also in the outer city during the battle, according to the guards. Winter stared at the table, brows furrowed, clearly thinking something through. Do you think it's possible they let you win and escape on purpose? Winter asked. Now it was Nick's turn to furrow his brows. Why do you think that? Everything fits too well, Winter said. You escape a brutal ambush. You see the leader's face. You grab one of their corpses. The leader openly walks into the outer city. This smells like a huge setup. Everything seems way too convenient. Winter, I killed 9 people, Nick said. Do you really think all 9 joined the mission knowing they'd give their lives? Do you really think they didn't fight for their survival? And the leader himself, was he here to die too, just to keep the secret? Winter kept staring at the table, brows furrowed. He could see Nick's logic, but it felt so unreal. How could anyone survive such an ambush? All the attackers were at least as powerful as Nick, and there had been 11 of them. So while Nick's words made sense, it still felt unreal. It seemed far more likely the enemy had planned for Nick to escape, so he'd blamed the wrong target. Maybe Solace sacrificed a few of their Johns to make Dark Dream blame and attack the Spartans. If it worked, Solace would gain a lot of Specters without angering Blitz. Was it really that simple? Was it really just the Spartans? Wintour, I killed 9 people, Nick said with annoyance. All 9 wanted to survive, none of them wanted to die. This wasn't some kind of setup. They honestly tried to get me. Get you? Wintour repeated. Tried to kill me, whatever, Nick said with annoyance. Wintour looked into Nick's eyes. The fact that Nick had said get instead of kill seemed suspicious. Wintour had known Nick for years, and felt Nick would have said kill here, not get. Were they really trying to kill you? Wintour asked. Nick gritted his teeth. No, they tried to disable me, he said with annoyance, but that's really not important. How is that not important? Wintour asked, equally annoyed. This gives way more credibility to my theory that someone set us up. Nick, do you honestly think you'd have survived if they really tried to kill you? Yes, Nick shouted, standing up. I am absolutely certain I can. That would have made no difference. Wintour looked deep into Nick's eyes. Silence. Are you sure? Wintour asked. Yes, I am, Nick said slowly through gritted teeth, eyes filled with anger. Silence. Wintour took a deep breath and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Do you know why they didn't want to kill you? He asked. Nick sat back down. Yes, he said 2 seconds later. Wintour nodded. Are you absolutely certain it's not a setup? He asked. Nick nodded solemnly. I am. Wintour took another deep breath, then sighed. Fine, he said. Then I believe you. Even though I'm dying to know what's going on, I trust you. Thank you, Nick answered, sighing himself. So what will they do next? Do you know? Wintour asked. Nick looked at the table. Telling Wintour was risky. This mirrored his situation with the city. If Wintour knew Nick was the target, not Dark Dream, he might just fire Nick to get the target off his back. After all, Dark Dream had become a target simply by being affiliated with Nick. Right now, Wintour believed Dark Dream was the true target, not Nick. Nick looked at Wintour for a bit. Wintour could tell Nick knew what the Spartans would do next. Nick weighed his next words for a while. Yes, I know what they're most likely going to do, he said. Their target is me, not Dark Dream, but they'll likely target Dark Dream now to get to me. Chapter 274, Assassinations. Yes, Nick had decided to tell Wintour the truth. At least regarding the Spartans' target. Wintour furrowed his brows. You're their target, he asked. Nick nodded. They don't want to attack Dark Dream. They want to capture me, Nick said. Wintour just looked at Nick for a while. That sounded unrealistic. Yet he hadn't lied about trusting Nick. Nick had seemed extremely confident earlier, and Wintour didn't feel like he was lying. So the Spartans were actually interested in capturing Nick, not really after Dark Dream at all. Are they the only ones after you? Wintour asked. Nick furrowed his brows. Well, there's someone who wants to get me, but they don't have the luxury of coming here themselves, so they're using the Spartans. Wintour realized something. If they couldn't come here themselves, it likely meant someone from outside the city was targeting Nick. Someone from Aegis, maybe a Specter. So as long as we don't deal with the actual person behind this, the Spartans won't be the only ones coming after you, Wintour asked. Nick took a deep breath and nodded. Wintour scratched his chin, looking aside for a couple of seconds. Why send the Spartans after you? They barely have 5 veterans. Why not ask Solace with over 20 veterans and even 2 experts? He asked. I'm not entirely sure, Nick said. A couple seconds of silence passed. Then Wintour realized something. If you're being targeted by a Specter, I can see why they'd use the Spartans, he said. Nick took a deep breath and nodded. The more information he gave Wintour, the more nervous he became. All right, so you're being targeted by a strong Specter that can even manipulate veterans, right? Wintour asked. Nick nodded. And you didn't want to tell me, because you thought I'd fire you to protect Dark Dream, right? Nick sighed and nodded again. Understandable, Wintour said. If I had some issue with you, this would be the best moment to get rid of you. But I don't. In fact, after surviving such a brutal ambush, you've only become more valuable. You're the most powerful level 2 extractor I've ever heard of, and the speed at which you're growing is also extremely impressive. You're valuable enough to risk everything. My goal isn't just to survive, but to grow big enough for a seat on Blitz, and without an outstanding chief Zephyx Extractor, that won't happen. I'm not going to abandon you, Wintour said. Nick hadn't expected Wintour to risk himself and his company this much just for him. Right now, Nick only felt relieved and a bit guilty for keeping things secret. However, Winter said, brows furrowed, I'm more surprised you're still here of your own volition. Nick raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? You're being targeted by a Specter beyond your power, and you're not looking for shelter or protection, Winter said. If I were you, I'd have sold my shares in Dark Dream and joined Blitz. I don't think there's a safer place in the city than Blitz. Even level 6 Specters would need to be extremely careful in there, Winter said. Nick looked at Winter with uncertainty. I don't want to abandon what we've built, Nick said, and I don't want to join any other manufacturers. It might sound stupid and naive, but I don't want to work for somebody exploiting people. At least here, I can control what happens. Nick sighed. Lastly, I want to become powerful as quickly as possible to redeem myself. Winter looked at Nick, brows furrowed. He had talked with Nick several times about this entire Horua business. Yes, Nick had been a dumbass, but he'd done his best to repay the boy, and he'd only been 16 at the time. He hadn't been a fully grown adult himself. Yet no matter what Winter said, Nick kept insisting he had to redeem himself. That was why Winter no longer brought up the topic. So you're not going to another manufacturer, Winter said. Right, Nick answered. All right, Winter said, standing up. Give me a second, he said before leaving the room. About a minute later, Winter returned with several sheets of paper. Around 15 newbies, a bit over 20 Johns and 5 veterans, Winter said, reading from one sheet. That's what the Spartans have. Nick looked at Winter with a determined gaze. These numbers didn't scare him. Lucky for us, Winter continued, they only recently got their first adult. The 3 brothers leading the Spartans left their old employer after becoming early veterans. At most, there's 1 mid-veteran among them. The other 2 advanced within the last 4 years, and I'm quite certain they're still initial veterans. In an open battle, they'd roll over us. Fortunately, the city's laws make an open battle impossible. In the end, this will likely go the way these things always go. They'll try to reduce our numbers in secret, and we'll try to reduce theirs. It's a battle of assassinations and intelligence. On top of that, they initiated the attack first, which gives me more leverage in deciding how this plays out. Nick raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Simple, Winter said. I'm Vernon Melfian's son, and the Spartans decided to attack my company. I'm going to tell Dad, and he's going to put a lot of pressure on them. Either they agree to my terms, or they lose all business relations with Blitz. That would mean their end. Chapter 275, Shadow Shroud. Darkness. Above, an endless plain of steel plates. Below, black water. In this space, nearly nothing lived. No insects, no fish, no animals, no humans. This was a space that rarely saw life. But at this moment, a completely black figure crawled across the endless ceiling of steel. If anyone saw it, they would run away in terror. It had no features, its entire body covered in some kind of black cloth. And yet it seemed to shine in the eternal darkness, almost as if light came from within, giving it an ethereal feel. Slowly, the figure buried its claws in the steel ceiling, leaving small holes behind. It had been traveling like this for several minutes. Finally, it stopped in front of one specific plate, no different from any other. That's it, the rat riding on the figure's torso said. Give me a second. The rat crawled away and latched onto a small crevice in the ceiling. Hey, hey, it shouted, I've got a deal for you. Silence. I know you guys have someone stationed here. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I've got a fresh new adult, and if you're not taking it, I'm giving it to Solace, the rat shouted. The black figure didn't move. Suddenly, the sound of steel moving came from behind the big plate. The plate slid aside. A person in the gray uniform of a Spartan Zephyx Extractor looked down into the hole. You got an offer, the guy asked uncertainly. The rat looked at him. Really? It asked with annoyance. You guys seriously only have a newbie guarding this hole? The newbie looked at the rat with discomfort. This was the parasite. He'd heard a lot about it, but never talked to it before. Should I call the supervisor? The newbie asked. Yes, the rat said excitedly. I got a great offer. The newbie still felt quite insecure facing the parasite. This was a level 5 Specter, a fanatic. Okay, give me a second, the newbie said, turning around. As he walked toward the entrance of the small room, a black mist crept out from the hole behind him. Sadly, he didn't notice. The newbie opened the door, walked out and closed it. As soon as he left, the artificial light in the room vanished. Keeping those lights running was extremely expensive. A moment later, a black figure manifested in one of the upper corners of the room. Completely black, yet somehow shining in the darkness. "Hey, the supervisor counts as a guard too, okay?" the rat shouted at the figure. "Sure," Nick said neutrally. Naturally, the black figure was Nick. Yet nothing about it resembled Nick at all. The black cloth covering him looked torn and unnatural, very similar to Specter's. Even the black nails at the ends of his hands felt just as strange. That was because Nick was essentially covered in materials made from Specters. The black cloth covering his body came from the Fiend of Darkness. The Fiend of Darkness was a floating black cloak shaped like a person, gaining power by enveloping victims in darkness. It was one of the rare few Specters that gained power by using an Eternal. When it spotted a victim, it rushed toward them and enveloped them with its body. A second later, the person vanished completely, and the Fiend of Darkness regained its old appearance. In truth, the victim was transported into a plane of darkness, where they lived until the nightmare killed them. It was almost like the Fiend of Darkness sacrificed people to the nightmare. The Fiend of Darkness had been a blight upon Crimson Fungus City decades ago. Luckily, it was eventually contained. The nails on Nick's fingertips came from the black nail. The black nail was a bleeding pile of flesh, with dozens of iron nails hammered into it. When it saw a victim, it floated over, summoned black nails, and slowly drove them into the body until the victim died. Death usually took several hours. The black nail was very good at killing its victims slowly. Meanwhile, several lines shone with artificial light on the inside of the black cloth. These were shining strings harvested from the blinding light, the Specter that had given Wintor his ability. The lines used external Zephyx to produce light. The black cloth blocked all of it. The black nails served as weapons and let Nick move silently. Combined, these let someone move through the darkness unnoticed and unaffected by the nightmare. This suit was a marvel of technology and very, very expensive. The blinding light was a level 3 Specter, the black nail level 4, the Fiend of Darkness level 5. Naturally, something made from all three carried a steep price. So steep, in fact, that it was worth about as much as all of Dark Dream. The suit Nick wore didn't belong to him. It was a loan from Vernon. All three Specters were owned by Blitz, and only they had suits like this. Every specialist and a couple of experts working for Blitz owned one. They were used for espionage, reconnaissance, and assassination. They were called Shadow Shrouds. Chapter 276, Infiltration. In one of the upper corners of the room, Nick waited in the darkness. Silence. Eventually, the light activated again, and a moment later, the door opened. A man with silver hair and silver eyebrows walked in, expression serious. Bang! A yellow barrier appeared around him, then broke apart an instant later. Before the guy could react, 5 long black nails rammed into the side of his head, leaving 5 deep holes. As soon as the black figure landed, it turned toward the entrance. The newbie from earlier stared forward in stunned silence. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't possibly react faster than Nick. In a fluid motion, Nick jumped at him. The newbie didn't even have a barrier. In one quick swoop, Nick crushed his head and pulled the body back into the room before closing the door. "Gimme, gimme, gimme," the rat shouted in excitement. Nick lingered near the closed door a while longer, listening. Nothing. Then he threw the 2 corpses toward the hole. He didn't bother checking them for valuables. Everything they owned was too hot. Everyone kept their wealth in bank accounts Nick couldn't access without authentication. Their barriers and other equipment couldn't be sold either, since big manufacturers custom-ordered their barriers. Selling one from the Spartans would be as good as admitting you'd killed one of them. And since killing people was illegal, that could get troublesome fast. So there was no reason to search the corpses. "Oh yeah," the rat shouted, using all its power to shove the 2 corpses into the hole. "Hey, these 2 count as the guards, okay?" Nick nodded. The rat smiled, happy to do business with you. Splash. 1 corpse fell into the sewers, and a moment later came the sound of dozens of rats tearing at the body. "Any further corpses count toward our next trade," the rat said cheerfully. Nick nodded and slithered out of the room. "Keep the lights on," the rat shouted. Ding! The lights turned off anyway. The rat frowned with annoyance. Even though it burned a lot of Zephyx keeping its rats alive in the dark, the parasite was still getting plenty out of this trade. Not even 24 hours had passed since Nick's conversation with Winter. After they finished talking, Winter quickly devised a plan to strike back. The longer they waited, the more time the Spartans had to prepare. As a possible suspect, Callum Sondur had spent several hours at the guard station and only left early the next morning. Since veterans no longer needed sleep, he'd probably gone straight to work to report the mission's outcome to the other two Spartans' leaders. That should have happened about 12 hours ago. Right now it was 10 p.m., the day after the attack on Nick's residence. In the last 12 hours, Winter had drawn up a plan of attack, talked to his father, secured the Shadow Shroud, and given Nick his orders. Nick's job was to strike back. There had been no declaration of war, but that didn't matter. Talking to the Spartans before attacking would only raise their guard. Right now, the Spartans probably felt very safe. They'd just come through a huge battle yesterday. No normal person would immediately rush back into battle after escaping such a devastating ambush. And how would the enemy even reach them? The Spartans were housed in the lower layer of the inner city, at the edge of the megastructure. Powerful guards and extractors were everywhere in the inner city. The only two ways into the Spartans' building were the entrance from the inner city and the one from the outer city, both heavily guarded. Additionally, the Spartans had 5 veterans and 20 Johns. Attacking them should have been impossible for something as weak as Dark Dream. Sadly for them, they'd overlooked a third entrance, the place where they traded with the parasite. That was to be expected. All the steel plates below the inner city looked the same, and nobody could tell which one led to their trading spot. There was also no light at all, making it impossible for any human to get there. And the trading room itself was almost as hard as a strong containment unit, openable only from the outside. The Spartans didn't fear anyone coming through that place. Sadly for them, Winter was their enemy. Winter had quickly worked out a good way in. The moment he thought of it, he contacted the parasite. Naturally, the parasite wasn't interested in betraying a customer, but Winter managed to convince it. The Spartans will get eradicated soon. You'll lose a customer regardless. Might as well turn the customer into food, Winter said. In the end, the parasite agreed. But it wanted something in return. It would lead Nick to the entrance, but in exchange, it would get the guards for free and priority over all the corpses Nick created during the mission. Lastly, Winter had asked Vernon for a Shadow Shroud. Usually, Cujoblitz would never hand one of its valuable Shadow Shrouds to anyone else. They didn't even give them to the city. However, Vernon was quite angry for several reasons. First, Dark Dream was essentially one of Cujoblitz's crops, since it would one day be sold to Cujoblitz. Second, Dark Dream belonged to Vernon's son, and fathers generally aren't fond of people attacking their children. Lastly, Vernon had made it clear Dark Dream was under his protection. And yet someone had attacked it anyway. If he did nothing now, no one would take his words seriously again. So Vernon loaned his personal Shadow Shroud to Nick. Yet he didn't expect much. He was more intent on making life hell for the Spartans. He'd handed over the shroud only because Winter asked for it. Vernon complied, but didn't think Nick would achieve anything. Sure, Nick had survived a brutal ambush, but that was because he'd fought inside his own house. The terrain advantage was his. Things would be different with the battlefield moved to the Spartans. What could a lone Peak John possibly do against them? Chapter 277, Abnormality. Outside the room, Nick found himself in a small, secluded hallway. Natural light shone through holes in the light shaft in the ceiling. The walls, ceiling, and floor were uniform steel with no gaps. The hallway was long, with no space for anyone to hide. The black figure in the brightly lit hallway seemed to collapse into black smoke, moving along the edge of the ceiling. At the end of the hallway, a set of stairs led upward, but before the smoke reached them, it stopped. A shadow. There was the shadow of a person on the stairs. Naturally, the supervisor Nick had killed had called for backup before going in. Trading with the parasite was illegal, and the supervisor wanted to make sure nobody accidentally wandered into this hallway and saw something they shouldn't. The black smoke studied the shadow for a while. Sadly, Nick couldn't tell which way the guard was facing from the shadow alone, and he couldn't check. If the guard was looking down the stairs, he'd see the black smoke coming out of the brightly lit hallway. And even if Nick killed him before he could sound an alarm, a second guard might be watching the first. After some deliberation, Nick decided the risk wasn't worth it. So he changed his approach. A moment later, the black smoke gathered at one of the small light holes and very slowly passed through. It took over 30 seconds, but eventually all the smoke passed through. Nick found himself in an extremely bright, reflective shaft about 10 by 10 centimeters wide. While he was inside, the light in the corridor below dimmed slightly. Luckily, it wasn't very noticeable. Then Nick floated forward. As he moved, the light brightened and dimmed. Approaching the stairs, his speed slowed to an absolute crawl, barely a centimeter per second. Minutes later, he finally arrived above the person casting the shadow. It was a level 2 extractor, looking toward the stairs leading to the hallway Nick had just left. But Nick noticed something else too. There was a glass door between the guy and the stairs. Had Nick charged forward, he'd have needed to break through it, likely triggering an alarm. What's he even doing there? There was also a second person in the room. A woman with fiery red hair sat on the ground of the little guard room, snacking on chips in boredom. Based on her demeanor, she didn't give a damn how she looked to the other person present. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered," the other guy said. He had brown and gray hair and watched the glass door leading to the small staircase with a serious expression. "Oh, come on, just tell me," the woman said. Surprisingly, she wore a newbie's uniform while he wore a John's. One might expect it the other way around, given how they acted. "No, I'm not telling you," the man said. "You have to learn to keep your mouth shut about company secrets." "Oh, so it is a secret," the woman said excitedly, popping another chip into her mouth. "Obviously," the guy said. "Why else would we be here?" "Is it a Specter?" she asked. Silence. "Oh, come on, just give me a little bit of the secret, pretty please, with sugar on top." The guy kept watching the staircase, his expression growing more annoyed. "I want to know, I want to know, I want to know, I want to know." The woman kept chanting like a child, though her tone made clear she was half joking. Maybe she thought it was adorable. "SHHH, shut up for a second," the guy said seriously, narrowing his eyes. "Do you see this?" "What?" the woman asked, her cute act dropped. "Come over," the man said, slowly drawing a gun from behind him. Realizing he was serious, the woman stopped joking. She stood, walked over, and looked at the same thing he was looking at. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "Is the light supposed to do that?" she asked. The light in the stairwell was pulsing slowly, dim and bright in a cycle of about 5 seconds. But it only happened in the small stairwell room, no flickering in the hallway or their own room. The man narrowed his eyes and raised his gun. "Something's going on in there," he said. "Call Adam." "Of course," the woman said seriously, turning to run toward the exit. The exit, too, was a glass door. She swiped her hand over a small piece of shining metal beside it before opening it and running through. Crack! A black object pierced her head from above, and she stopped mid-stride, eyes wide. In a fluid motion, a black figure landed, lifted the body, and stepped into the guard room. The remaining guard kept watching the stairs. The light had been bright for over 3 seconds, different from before. Crack! An orange barrier appeared around him, then broke. Sadly, the barrier wasn't the only thing that broke. Chapter 278, Light Layer. Earlier, Nick had scouted the room through the light holes and seen another exit leading into a second brightly lit hallway. Just like the first, this one also had a glass door. Apparently, glass doors were standard in this building. After scouting, Nick realized it was impossible to kill both guards while they stayed inside the room. But he had to kill them. Since he'd moved so slowly earlier, nearly 5 minutes had already passed since the infiltration began. The guard probably suspected something was off, and if the supervisor didn't reappear soon, he'd likely investigate. So Nick had to act. He needed more time, so he devised a plan. If something strange seemed to be happening in the stairwell, they'd call for reinforcements rather than sound the alarm outright. What if it was only something stuck in the light shaft? That meant one of them would go for reinforcements, splitting them up. And since there was only one other exit, they'd have to leave through it. So Nick expanded his body. His lower half stretched and contracted in the light shaft near the stairs, while his upper half emerged from a light hole in the hallway behind the other exit. When he heard the guy tell the woman to get reinforcements, Nick pulled his lower body back and fully materialized. Luckily, the hallway ceiling was higher than the door, leaving a blind spot above it. He killed the woman as she passed below, pulled her body into the room, then killed the other guy. That was risky, Nick thought, heart pounding in his ears. The maneuver had cost him over 50% of his Zephyx, and any mistake would have forced him to abort the mission. Now there were 2 corpses in the room, and he needed to get rid of them before anyone wandered down this hallway. A moment later, Nick examined the guy's right hand. Earlier, he'd seen the woman pause in front of the door and do something he couldn't see before it opened. That meant the doors were secured somehow. After a moment, he noticed the glove, or more precisely, one glove. The guy wore a single fingerless glove on his right hand, with a small metal plate on the band. Nick took the glove, put it on his own right hand, and swiped it over the small sensor beside the door. Clicking. A quiet metallic noise came from the door, and Nick pushed it open. Sure enough, it opened. Nick grabbed the 2 corpses and ran into the hallway, then opened the door to the trading spot and found a rat waiting. Seeing Nick with 2 corpses, the rat's face lit up. "You eating that?" it asked. Nick wordlessly threw the corpses toward the hole and ran out, closing the door behind him. Looking down the corridor, he gritted his teeth. He'd left a trail of blood carrying the bodies down here. Nick pulled a small bottle of red powder from the shadow shroud. He carefully opened it and sprinkled the powder along the trail as he retraced his steps. The blood trail vanished. The bottle held spores from the crimson fungus, which converted blood into Zephyx on contact. But pure Zephyx wasn't stable in open air, which was why it was always stored as crystals or in special containers. Left unstored, it reverted to prefix within seconds. And prefix was everywhere. So essentially, the blood trail turned into nothing. Nick opened the door with his stolen glove and left the guard room behind. This must have been some kind of small outpost, meaning Nick was now inside the actual office. A moment later, he turned to smoke and entered the light shaft. At the end of the corridor, the shaft expanded dramatically. It was no longer a shaft but a light layer, like Nick had entered a thin world made entirely of light. He could see the shafts leading to the edge of the megastructure, their light bouncing through this reflective layer until it found an exit. Sadly, there was a problem. No more light holes, only small windows. Nick couldn't turn corporeal inside such a thin layer, meaning he couldn't damage or break the windows leading out. As he slithered through the light layer, he saw people passing beneath him, mostly guards and cleaners. It was nighttime, and most clerks worked days. I don't want to walk through the building in corporeal form, Nick thought. The hallways are too straight and well lit. So he kept searching the light layer, moving down different shafts and back out again. No matter how much he searched, he found no light holes. It seemed the Spartans only had windows. For minutes he kept searching. Finally, he found something interesting. Nick found himself atop a window much bigger than the others, and he wasn't sure what to make of what he saw below. Chapter 279, Hole. Nick was above a containment unit. For security reasons, containment units didn't have their entire ceiling covered in glass, or at least the cheap ones didn't. The expensive ones used materials either treated with Zephyx or harvested directly from powerful Specters. After all, level 3 Specters and higher could break through basically any conventionally made material. Since the treated materials made windows, entrances, and walls functionally identical, the only real difference for the expensive containment units was price, and not even by much. This one wasn't among the expensive kind. It was lit by a single ceiling window, about 1 meter square. The window sat over 2 meters below the light layer, leaving an empty space above it roughly 1 by 1 by 2 meters. Nick could materialize here without issue. However, there was no exit from this pocket of space. Looking through the window, Nick saw the Specter inside, a small gray ball with 8 metallic legs, like a cyber spider without eyes. He wasn't sure what kind of Specter it was or what it could do. Manufacturers kept their Specters secret except for their biggest one. For the Spartans, that should be their sole adult, formerly the Gray Room. Nick was sure this wasn't their adult, since containment units like this one could only securely hold adolescents. An adult would break out with minimal effort. He also doubted this was the Gray Room itself. Not impossible, but Nick didn't think he was that lucky. For a while he just studied the Specter. I can't find a good exit from the light shaft, which means I'd have to go back to the entrance and go in the traditional way. He furrowed his brows. But that's risky. He kept watching the Specter. Or... Nick took a deep breath and studied the window more closely, searching for something specific. After a while he found it. 8 connection points, he thought. As Chief Zephyx Extractor, Nick knew how containment units worked, and he put that knowledge to use now. The Specter is barely 10 centimeters wide. I think I can get it through the connections. But only if it's cooperative and listens. Nick turned corporeal, and his ability deactivated immediately. He was now blocking a good part of the light shaft, casting a huge shadow into the middle of the containment unit. The small Specter shifted to the edge of its cell. It had no eyes, but Nick was sure it could perceive him. One of Nick's metallic nails dug a hole in the middle of the window. The nails, made by an elder, needed barely any force to poke a tiny, smooth hole through the glass. Nick deliberately kept the hole small. "Are you sentient?" he whispered through it. The Specter stood silently at the edge of its cell. "If you understand me, make a scratching noise with your right leg." "Nothing." "Listen, I'm not here to scout you out. I'm here to hurt the Spartans. I wouldn't damage such a valuable containment unit just to ask you questions." "Do you want to get out and kill a couple of them or not?" Nick asked. Still nothing. Nick waited. "Scratch." His eyes lit up at the sight of the Specter's front right leg scratching the ground. "All right, you understand me, right?" Nick asked. Another scratch. "Good," he said. "Are you willing to cooperate with me temporarily?" Right scratch for yes, left for no. Right scratch. "All right," Nick said. "I'm going to get you out of here. After that, we'll travel through the building doing a couple of things, maybe kill a few people. In exchange, I'll let you escape the building on your own." "Deal." Right scratch. "Good to hear," Nick said with a smirk. "Can you climb walls?" The small gray spider scurried up the wall with impressive speed and stopped just below the window. Nick studied it up close now, just a pane of glass between them. "Move aside a bit," he said. "These windows are wired with thin electrical connections. There are 8 connection points at the edges, here, 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 and their opposite sides. Each spot has a wire running to a mesh in the middle that ties them all together. If any wire is exposed to air, its current changes and triggers the alarm. We don't want that." After Nick explained, the spider moved out of the way. "I'm going to cut a hole in the middle. When you come through later, be very careful not to crack the window." Nick pressed one of his nails to the glass and began cutting smooth lines through the middle. Without such advanced, powerful nails, he couldn't have cut through without cracking it. It took over 3 minutes to remove the layers of glass. In the end, there was a hole about 30 centimeters across in the middle of the window. "All right, you can come out," Nick said. The spider moved slowly and carefully toward the hole. Chapter 280, Office. Because of the shadow shroud, it was impossible to see Nick's expression, but he was very nervous right now. Specters couldn't feel empathy, and their own gain was their highest priority. Many were also completely insane. The empath and the bleeding lady were good examples. It was entirely possible the Specter would attack him the instant he freed it. Nick watched it move slowly and carefully through the hole. His heart rate spiked, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Once through, the Specter moved to the wall of the light shaft and waited. Scratch, scratch. It scratched the wall twice with a right foot. Nick nodded. "Good to have you on board," he said. "First, I need to find a good place to exit. I'll need your help cutting an opening." Nick turned back into black smoke, keeping his attention on the Specter. He knew it had no idea about his abilities, but he still felt uneasy in his most vulnerable form with a Specter this close. Luckily, it didn't do anything. Nick floated upward into the light layer. Sarke, 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 sarke. The spider followed quickly and quietly, only the scratch of its feet audible. Nick kept glancing back, but it did nothing suspicious. He was glad it was small enough to fit into the light shaft. He flew directly toward one of the offices at the edge of the hallway. He'd spotted this office earlier while searching for an opening. When they reached a good spot above it, Nick formed a circle with his smoke body. The Specter understood and moved to the middle, planting its 8 feet on the ground. Shing! It rotated in place, cutting a perfect circle. It grabbed the loose section of ceiling and pulled it back into the light layer. Then Nick moved through the hole. Since the opening was large, he passed through quickly without spending any Zephyx. Naturally, there was no one in the office but Nick. He turned corporeal and searched through the papers. "Give me a second. Maybe there's something valuable here," he said. The Specter climbed through the hole and settled on the ceiling. For about a minute, Nick sorted through files and folders. From the type of documents and the names on them, he could tell whose office this was. A team leader, either a peak John or an initial veteran. Eventually, he found something valuable. A map of the entire building. The first thing Nick did was check on the Specter he'd freed. "Wait, you're the gray room?" he asked. "Scratch. That means you're a peak adolescent," Nick said. "I didn't expect them to keep you in such a cheap containment unit." The Specter didn't answer. "Are you confident you could quickly take down a peak level 2 extractor, even with their barrier active?" Scratch, scratch. Surprisingly, the gray room scratched once with a left leg and once with a right. "Does that mean it depends?" Nick asked. "Right leg scratch. What if you get the drop on them?" "Right leg scratch. And in a direct battle?" "Left leg scratch." "Okay, understood," Nick said, turning back to the map. It showed every containment unit and every Specter. This map was incredible. According to it, the Spartans had 10 hatchlings and 8 adolescents, plus many empty units. Shouldn't they have an adult? Nick thought, brows furrowed, scanning the map. He couldn't find a level 3 Specter anywhere on it. But one containment unit was marked entirely in red. Nick assumed this was the adults unit, and that the team leader simply lacked the clearance for details. He couldn't be sure, though. Nick pocketed the map and grabbed a few more documents that looked interesting, meaning to bring them to Wintour. Then he turned to the Specter. "I want to know what kind of Specter is in the red containment unit," Nick said, pointing at the red spot on the map. "After that, we're going to scout the surroundings and cause some chaos." The gray room scratched the wall once. Nick nodded and turned back to fog, re-entering the light layer, the gray room following. As Nick traveled toward the red containment unit, he kept an eye on the rooms and offices they passed. About 2 minutes later, they arrived above it. Unlike the unit that had housed the gray room, this was one of the expensive ones. Instead of a small window, its entire ceiling was glass. That normally let people outside see the whole unit, giving valuable intel about what was inside. After all, what if a dangerous Specter waited right above the entrance to kill anyone who walked in? But some manufacturers didn't bother with that and just shoved their containment units under a wall. Dark Dream was one of them. When Nick arrived above this one and looked inside, what he saw shocked him. Nothing. It was empty. Absolutely nothing inside. Not even fog, smoke, water, or distortion. Completely clear. Why is it empty? Where is their adult? Chapter 281, Team Leaders. Nick studied the empty containment unit for a while. This was the only unit on the map that could possibly house their adult, he thought. Every other unit is either occupied by weaker Specters or empty, and this one is expensive. They wouldn't just leave it empty. That's a waste of investment. Is there truly nothing in there? He circled the ceiling a bit to check. Sure enough, no hum from the electronics, Nick thought. The containment unit isn't even on. Does that mean their adult is somewhere else? No, as far as I can tell, the map makes sense, and there are no suspicious empty spaces. Also, why keep your strongest Specter secret even from your own team leaders? That's strange. And why was this unit marked red on the map at all? Nick grew suspicious. Do they even have an adult? Based on what Wintour said, the Spartans started as 3 veterans who left Kugelblitz to build their own business. They quickly gathered some adolescents and newbies, but for years couldn't land an adult. Then about half a year ago, they announced they'd caught one. But did they? I've never heard any details about this adult. Yet the leader's power grew. John Keyweather even demonstrated the strength of a mid-veteran. They shouldn't be able to do that without an adult. Had Nick been corporeal, his brows would have furrowed. Something is going on, he thought. As far as I can tell, there's no adult in any containment unit, yet the veteran's power still increased. That's impossible without one. Suddenly, a revelation struck him. Unless they do have one, just not inside any containment unit. What if it's walking around, disguised as a normal human? The Spartans have obviously been contacted by one of Envy's servants, otherwise the ambush wouldn't have happened. If the servant reached out 6 to 12 months ago, that lines up with their announcement of catching an adult. I don't know if the servant is bribing, controlling, blackmailing, or trading with them, but one thing's clear. It's boosting the veteran's power. Working with a Specter like this is about as illegal as it gets, though, and if anyone finds out, they're all dead. So they keep it secret, telling their team leaders and normal extractors they caught an adult. To sell the story, they claim their most expensive containment unit houses it, without giving any details. That explains why the team leader marked this one red, while leaving every other empty unit unmarked. He thinks an adult is contained here, but there isn't. So where is it among the employees? Nick didn't like that thought one bit. A venomous snake was hiding among a bunch of harmless ones. If Nick grabbed the wrong one. Eventually, he turned around and returned to the light layer above the hallway. Yes, a dangerous specter lurked among the enemy, but he still couldn't just leave. He'd simply have to be careful. It was possible the specter wasn't among the employees at all, but some kind of visitor or outside consultant. Eventually, Nick stopped above another office, this one occupied. A beautiful blonde woman sat inside, writing on a sheet of paper. Based on the size and look of the office, Nick guessed she was another team leader. His smoke body stopped above her head and formed a circle. His meaning was clear. The gray room moved into position and waited. Nick moved aside. Silence. Bang. The gray room cut through the floor and pushed itself down by jumping off the ceiling. The woman startled, but before she could look around, it landed on her head. Her barrier wasn't active. Even though these barriers were expensive, their slight, constant drain on Zephyx annoyed some people. Most kept them active anyway and lived with the irritation, but some, especially when they felt safe, switched them off. And this team leader, sitting in her own office, probably felt no place was safer. As soon as the gray room landed on her head, her eyes went unfocused and she fell forward, head hitting the desk. Nick came through the hole and materialized, looking at her. She didn't move, yet she was still alive and apparently unhurt. It was clear to Nick that the gray room was feeding. He wasn't sure how it fed, but her state was too abnormal otherwise. Nick furrowed his brows, grabbed her neck and broke it. "We're here to kill. I told you I'd let you escape the building, but in exchange you helped me," he said. The gray room stayed still a while before returning to the walls. It didn't communicate further. Nick looked at the dead team leader. This should be the third. The first was probably the guy with the yellow barrier during my ambush, the only one with a yellow barrier while everyone else had orange. I didn't think much of the color at the time, but the supervisor I killed near the trading post also had a yellow one, probably a team leader too. So she's the third. I don't know how many teams the Spartans have, but I bet almost all their team leaders are dead by now. Chapter 282, Guards. It was almost funny that the Spartans used to have around 30 Johns, and even though Nick hadn't killed half of them, he'd likely gotten all or most of their team leaders. Nick looked around the office a bit and gathered a few important-looking documents. "All right," he said to the gray room. "Let me check how things look outside. I'll be back soon." Nick turned to smoke and re-entered the light layer. About half a minute later, he returned. "I know what we're doing next," he said. "First, we clear the hallway. One of the extractors is walking to an office nearby. You take him." Nick grabbed the glove from the dead team leader's right hand, put it on, and stuffed the old glove into the corpse's pockets. Then he opened the door with the glove and pointed down the hallway. "Down there, he should round the corner soon. I'll watch the other side," Nick said. The gray room scrambled through the door and down the corridor, waiting near the edge. Nick watched the other side, keeping an eye on every door. If even one opened, he'd kill whoever came out. See-a-rah-rah-rah-rah. Nick turned and saw the gray room spinning atop the orange barrier of someone who just rounded the corner. An instant later, the barrier broke and the gray room landed on the guy's head. Nick nodded, went back for the corpse in the office, and carried it over to the gray room. "You can stay on him a bit longer," Nick said, lifting the still-living body with the gray room riding on top. He didn't kill the body outright to avoid a mess. Blood in the hallway would give away his presence immediately. Nick checked the corner and found the hallway empty. Then he silently moved through hallway after hallway, door after door, down a guard room, downstairs, down another corridor to the last door. "Oh, that looks good," the rat shouted excitedly. Nick had brought the 2 corpses to the parasite. Every corpse was valuable. A Peak John was worth 50 normal corpses. Nick broke the neck of the still-living body and tossed it forward. The gray room hopped off and landed on the wall. The rat eyed the little gray specter with interest. "Oh, you found a friend," it said. Nick glanced at the motionless gray room and pointed at the exit. "Later, when we're done, you can escape through here. It leads into the sewers. Just remember to keep your end of the promise. For now, you're still helping me," he said. The rat grinned. With a helper, Nick would bring even more corpses. Yeah, you should listen to him, the rat told the gray Specter. He's honest, never breaks a promise. If he says he'll let you go, he will. Also, don't make him angry. He's a lot more dangerous than he looks. The gray room said nothing, just walked back toward the entrance. Its intent was clear. Good, Nick said, running out again with the gray room. As the lights turned off, the rat eyed the two corpses. Today is a good day. Meanwhile, Nick and the gray room ran down the hallway again. On the way, Nick explained his plan, and the gray room seemingly vanished. Nick stealthily rounded a couple of corners and stopped beside a door, this one made of metal, unlike the others. Instead of breaking in, he waited beside it. Crash! The sound of metal being torn apart came from behind the door. A specter, someone screamed. The alarm, run! Many voices cried out behind the door. Suddenly it opened. Bang! Nick killed the person running out and smoothly pulled the corpse into the room behind him. 7 people were inside, several blindly running toward Nick without noticing him. Their attention was fixed on the other end of the room, where the gray room had broken through the ceiling, landed on someone's head, and settled there directly beside the alarm. The people in the room wore tactical gear. Not Extractors, guards. Knowing they couldn't fight a Specter, their first instinct was to sound the alarm and run. Sadly, none of them dared reach for it. Instead, they ran outside, right into Nick's arms. He killed all of them in under 5 seconds. This was the guards' main gathering place, where they rested between patrols. They were Nick's biggest obstacle in this mission. If a patrolling guard noticed several colleagues missing, the alarm would go off. Nick gathered the corpses. He'd killed them carefully enough to avoid spilling blood, and after some improvising, knotted pieces of their clothing into a makeshift rope to drag the whole pile. Then he slowly left the room and made his way down the hallway. Shing! But then a door opened down the hall, and an extractor stepped out. Nick stopped. He was over 30 meters from the man, dragging a huge pile of corpses behind him. This was a problem. Chapter 283, The Screamer. Nick had none of his spears or fist weapons with him, since they could identify him, meaning he had no ranged weapon. He had to decide, and there was no time for hesitation. Without thinking, he grabbed the gray spider and threw it at the extractor. She barely turned before her vision filled with the gray Specter. An orange barrier appeared around her. Crack! The gray room spun and broke through it. When she lost all her Zephyx, she lost her power and collapsed. The gray room landed on her, walked up to her head and settled there. Nick sighed in relief. Sorry, he said, had to act fast. The gray room didn't answer, just sat on the unconscious extractor's head. Nick guessed it had no complaints. After adding her to the pile, he continued toward the exit. Ooh, that looks nice, the parasite said, seeing Nick enter with 8 corpses. Sorry, time's up, Nick said, killing the extractor, speaking to the gray room still feeding on her. He dumped all the corpses into the hole and heard a cacophony of splashes and crunching from the sewers below. Man, I knew it was the right call to accept this deal, the parasite said as Nick left. This city is quickly becoming one of my best hunting grounds. Nick and the gray room reached the central hallways again. On the way, they found someone cleaning. No time, can't get found out. Nick killed the cleaning lady and carried her corpse along, then cleared out the rest of the cleaning staff, gathering 2 more bodies. He delivered all 3 to the parasite and went back inside. A moment later, he decided to kill most of the clerks in their offices. What if one of them went looking for someone? Over the next 10 minutes, Nick killed around 15 clerks and delivered them as well. By now he'd killed 15 clerks, 7 guards, 3 cleaners, and 6 extractors. The more people he killed, the more he thought about yesterday's ambush. These people had all wanted him dead. This was what they deserved. Nick had been inside the Spartans' building for over 30 minutes now. Eventually, he cleared out most of the offices. Only the executives' offices remained, and those he specifically avoided. Attacking a veteran risked exposure. He also avoided the building's 2 entrances, certain to be guarded. All right, Nick said to the gray room, change of plans. He pulled out the map and studied it, then walked to one of the doors and opened it. This door was noticeably thicker than the others, leading to a small room with another door. After fiddling with a console, he opened the second door. A terrifying, ear-grating screech tore through the room. Nick's heart nearly stopped. He just opened a containment unit. In the corner crouched a hysterical, beautiful woman, screaming in absolute terror at the top of her lungs. That's why she's called the Screamer, Nick thought. A young woman also sat in the corner, her expression tense and uncomfortable, an extractor, a newbie by her uniform. She was so focused on resisting the screaming she didn't even notice the door had opened. Nick ran in and killed her. The Specter kept screaming. "Hey, can you hear me?" Nick shouted, his voice drowned by the high-pitched shrieks. Still screaming. "If you're sentient, tell me now, otherwise I'm going to kill you." More screaming. The Specter seemed completely beside herself in panic. "All right then," Nick shouted. Bang! The screams cut off as Nick punched her in the face. Then he grabbed her head and tore it apart, flesh and blood splattering the walls and floor. To be sure she was truly dead, he tore her into several pieces. Specters were remarkably resilient. Once certain she was dead, Nick sighed. The first Specter I've ever killed, he thought, looking at the gory remains. His goal was to hurt the Spartans as much as possible, and beyond killing their employees, destroying their Specters was the next best thing. He'd already taken their old primary Specter, the Grey Room, and now killed one outright. Nick left the pieces inside the containment unit and left with the Extractor's corpse. Luckily, the outer doors were soundproof, so nobody in the building heard the screaming. Not luck, really. Every manufacturer isolated a Specter like this behind soundproof walls. Startling the whole building every time someone entered wasn't ideal. Nick closed the door, turned to the Grey Room waiting on the wall. "Not sentient," he said, and the two of them left. After delivering the corpse, Nick moved to the next containment unit. With the team leader's card, entering them all was easy. Nick would make sure the Spartans regretted ever attacking him. Chapter 284, The Approaching Finale. When Nick entered the next containment unit, he wasn't surprised to see a big fleshy worm. He was surprised, though, to see two people inside watching him. Nick looked back, stepped forward, and closed the entrance behind him. The two were newbies who'd been working with the bloodworm. Nick killed them quickly, then tore the bloodworm apart. No descendants of the blood ancestor were sentient, and any non-sentient Specter would die by Nick's hand. After killing it, he delivered the two corpses to the parasite. Then he entered the next containment unit. This time he found half a torso inside. It belonged to a man, who glanced at Nick emotionlessly without a word. Seeing Nick's get up, he raised an eyebrow but said nothing. This Specter was called the Agonizing Weight, and Nick hadn't expected to find a humanoid one in here. The name didn't sound very human at all. "Hey, you're sentient, right?" Nick asked. The man just looked at him. "You better answer or I'll kill you," Nick said. Silence. "Alrighty then," Nick said. Boom! Nick exploded forward. Crack! His nails hit the wall as the torso flung itself aside with its arms. "I didn't think you were serious," the torso said, narrowing its eyes, not seeming very perturbed. "What's this about?" "So you are sentient," Nick said. "I am," the Agonizing Weight said. "Good," Nick said, nodding. "I'm not with these people. I'm their enemy, and I want to do as much damage as possible. I've already killed a couple of their non-sentient Specters. For the sentient ones, I'm offering a trade. A bit of your help for your freedom. You're not the first to join me." The Agonizing Weight studied Nick, brows furrowed. "Fine, I'll come with you," he said, "though I don't know how you plan to get me out of here." Nick pointed at the light window in the ceiling. "If this unit's like the others, I can cut a 30-centimeter hole without tripping the alarm. Lose one arm and you can fit through." The Agonizing Weight still looked suspicious. "All right, make the hole," he said. Nick nodded. "Give me a second." He left the containment unit, closed the door, and traveled as fog through the light layer to the other side of the shaft. There he cut a hole at the side first, digging through a layer of metal into the hallway. He hadn't done this with the Grey Room since such a hole would be noticeable, but with fewer people around now, he took the risk. Besides, he was nearly finished here. Once done, he re-entered the light shaft and cut a hole in the window. "All right, can you fit through without damaging the window?" "Damage it and the alarm goes off," Nick said. The Agonizing Weight studied the hole a moment, then tore off one arm, shoulder and all. He tossed the arm through, then threw himself through with the other. From the small tunnel to the hallway, Nick watched him reattach his arm. The two returned to the hallway. Once there, the Agonizing Weight looked at the gray spider beside him with a neutral expression. Nick eyed the big hole he'd cut and grew nervous. If anyone walks through here, they'll notice immediately, he thought. We're out of time. Nick turned in a specific direction. Time for the finale, he said. After you two help me with this last one, you can both leave through the hole. The gray room knows where it is, he told the agonizing Wait. No answer. The three of them ran down the hallway. Reaching a specific containment unit, Nick stopped and studied it. Just as expected, he thought, seeing the huge, complex console controlling it. He recognized the model. The fog had been contained in one just like it. He cut through the wall at a specific spot. Behind it was a panel marked with a lightning bolt, the central Zephyx storage powering the unit. Containment units built to suppress force Specters needed a constant Zephyx supply, and this panel hid that supply. Nick carefully cut through it and found 4 vials, 2 full white ones, 1 half white and 1 clear. The white ones were filled to the brim with Zephyx, each holding a kilo. That meant 2.5 kilos of Zephyx sat in front of him. Nick grinned. Then he stepped back. We'll free our friend later, he told the other 2 Specters. Something else first. He led the 3 of them down the hallway and stopped in front of a set of offices. Go check if he's still in there, Nick told the gray room. It climbed the wall and dug into the light layer. With the finale underway, there was no more need for stealth. A few seconds later, the gray room crawled back out and scratched once with its right leg. Nick grinned. I need you two in this fight. You don't have to kill him, just distract him. Who's in there? The agonizing Wait asked. John Keyweather, Nick said, the CEO. And he's a mid-veteran. Nick pulled a black ball from his pocket and glanced at the 2 Specters waiting nearby. Bang! He kicked the door open and threw the ball to the ground. Whoom! A cloud of black smoke exploded from the ball.